The September rain hammered against the stone walls of the abandoned wine cellar, each drop echoing through chambers that had kept their secrets for 56 years. Daniel Brennan stood in the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting through dust motes thick as fog, his hand trembling as he reached for the leather-bound journal that would change everything. But that moment, that discovery that would unravel a conspiracy spanning half a century, lay 8 months in the future. On this January morning, Daniel sat in a law office that smelled of old paper and broken dreams, holding a foreclosure notice that represented either the worst mistake of his life or the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. The attorney's voice droned on, explaining terms and conditions, but Daniel's attention had drifted to the photograph on the auction listing. Castellano Estate Vineyard, 80 acres of Napa Valley hillside, crowned by a Victorian manor house that stood like a fated queen surveying her neglected kingdom. The vines in the photograph twisted across the slopes in orderly rows, their winter bare branches reaching toward a sky the color of pewter. Something about the image pulled at him, a magnetism he couldn't explain, as if the land itself was calling across the decades to claim him. At 58, Daniel Brennan had become an expert in letting go. 3 years earlier, he had buried his wife Jennifer after a battle with cancer that had methodically stripped away everything they had built together. The house in Palo Alto, with its memories soaked into every wall, had become unbearable. He sold it, resigned from his position as chief financial officer at Axiom Technologies, and found himself adrift in a world that no longer made sense. 25 years of corporate finance, of board meetings and quarterly reports, of building someone else's empire, and what did he have to show for it? A 401k that would keep him comfortable, 2 grown children who worried about him more than they should, in a hollow space where purpose used to live. The attorney cleared his throat, pulling Daniel back to the present. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Courthouse steps, Napa County. Minimum bid $220,000. Daniel had $420,000 from the sale of his home, another $180,000 from Jennifer's life insurance policy, money that sat in his account like an accusation, waiting for him to do something meaningful with it. His children were financially independent now. Michael, 29, had his MBA from Stanford in a consulting job that paid obscenely well. Rebecca, 25, had found her calling as a sommelier, teaching wine classes and building a reputation in San Francisco's restaurant scene. They didn't need his money. They needed him to need something. Daniel's grandfather had been an Italian immigrant who came to California in 1947 with nothing but calloused hands in a dream of working with soil and sun. He found employment at a small vineyard in Napa Valley, a place called Castellano Estate, where a man named Vincent Castellano was revolutionizing the art of winemaking. Daniel's grandfather would come home with stories of the old world techniques Vincent employed, the careful selection of each grape, the almost mystical understanding of how soil and climate and timing created something transcendent. He spoke of wine the way poets speak of love, as if it were something holy. But Daniel's father had been practical, pushing his son toward business school, toward spreadsheets and profit margins. Wine was a romantic notion for immigrants and dreamers. Real success, real security came from understanding numbers, from making yourself indispensable to companies that would pay you well to protect their bottom line. Daniel had been a dutiful son. He buried his grandfather's stories deep and built a career on logic and analysis. Now at 58, those stories were surfacing like objects rising from the depths of a long, frozen lake. The research had started innocently enough. Insomnia had become Daniel's constant companion since Jennifer's death. And on one particularly endless night, he found himself searching for information about his grandfather's early years in America. A casual Google search led him to the Castellano Estate listing. The property had been foreclosed after decades of decline, the vines neglected, the winery shuttered, the Victorian manor slowly surrendering to time and weather. But it was the history that seized him. Vincent Castellano had been a visionary. In 1965, he created a wine called Castellano Reserve, that wine critics declared a masterpiece, California's answer to the great French vintages. The wine sold for $500 a bottle, an astronomical sum in the 1960s, and demand far exceeded supply. Then in October of 1968, Vincent Castellano vanished. No body was ever found. No note explained his disappearance. The business partnership with Gerald Whitmore dissolved in acrimony. The vineyard fell into decline. Within a decade, the legendary Castellano Reserve existed only in the memories of collectors and the climate-controlled cellars of those wealthy enough to have secured a bottle before everything fell apart. Daniel had spent 3 sleepless weeks researching, reading old newspaper articles, wine journals, business records. The mystery consumed him in a way nothing had since Jennifer's illness gave him something to fight against. He discovered that his grandfather had worked at Castellano Estate from 1950 until 1968, leaving abruptly the same month Vincent disappeared. In a bound of his grandfather's belongings stored in Daniel's garage, he found a journal entry dated October 1968. The handwriting was shaky, the words cryptic. Vincent was right to be afraid. Some men will kill to protect their lies. I cannot speak of what I suspect. I can only pray the truth surfaces someday, when it's safe. What truth? What lies? The questions burrowed into Daniel's mind and refused to leave. The deeper Daniel researched, the more troubling the pattern became. Vincent Castellano wasn't the only person connected to the vineyard who'd met a suspicious end or simply vanished. In 1972, a marine biologist named Dr. Alan Pierce, who'd been studying water quality near Castellano Estate, died in what was ruled an accidental drowning, though his research notes were never recovered. In 1976, a former employee named Roy Fisher told friends he had information about Vincent's disappearance, then died in a hit-and-run that was never solved. The local newspaper archives showed a pattern of witnesses who either disappeared or stopped talking, all connected to Gerald Whitmore's business dealings. But what caught Daniel's attention most was a more recent connection. In 2019, a man named Anthony Castellano, identified in one obituary as Vincent's grandson, had died in a boating accident in the San Francisco Bay. The circumstances were vague, the investigation brief, the conclusion that he'd fallen overboard during a solo sail on a calm day. Daniel found Anthony's LinkedIn profile still active. Marine environmental researcher, published papers on coastal ecology and water contamination. And 3 months before his death, Anthony had updated his profile with a new interest: California wine industry history and environmental practices, 1960s era. Daniel made detailed notes, creating a timeline that suggested something far darker than a simple business dispute. He found references in wine industry publications to rumors that had circulated for decades about the Whitmore family's connections to organized crime, about counterfeit wines, about business practices that went beyond aggressive into criminal. Most tellingly, he found a brief mention in a 1985 trade journal that several former Whitmore Wine Estates employees had attempted to blow the whistle on accounting irregularities but had been silenced through lawsuits and non-disclosure agreements. One accountant in particular, the article noted, had been fired after questioning discrepancies in the mid-1980s and had disappeared from public record entirely. Daniel made a note to find that accountant if the investigation went any further. Someone who tried to expose the truth 30 years ago might still have information, might still have the courage to speak if given protection and a platform. Michael had been skeptical when Daniel first mentioned the auction. They met for lunch at a bistro in Palo Alto, the kind of place where tech executives discuss valuations over organic kale salads. Michael ordered as usual, barely looking up from his phone as he scrolled through emails. When Daniel showed him the listing, his son's face cycled through concern, confusion, and something close to alarm. "Dad, you're 58 years old. You've never run a business, let alone a vineyard. The wine industry is cutthroat, margins are razor thin, and you'd be competing against established estates with decades of reputation and distribution networks already in place." Daniel had expected this reaction. His son had inherited his own talent for risk assessment, for seeing the logical flaws in any venture. It was what made Michael successful in consulting. It was also what would keep him forever playing it safe. "Your grandfather worked there," Daniel said quietly. "Did I ever tell you that?" Michael's fingers stilled on his phone screen. "No, you barely talk about him. He came to America with nothing. He found work at this vineyard, and for 18 years he was happy. He would come home and tell my father stories about Vincent Castellano, about the art of making wine, about understanding what the soil was trying to tell you. Then Vincent disappeared, and Grandpa quit the next day. He never made wine again. Never even talked about it. He took a job at a cannery and worked there until he died. What are you really trying to do here, Dad? Michael's voice had softened, the analyst's edge replaced by something more vulnerable. Is this about wine, or is it about filling the space Mom left? The question landed like a fist to the solar plexus. Daniel looked out the window at University Avenue, at people moving with purpose toward destinations that mattered to them. When had he last felt that kind of certainty? Maybe it's about both, Daniel admitted. Maybe it's about finding out if there's anything left in me besides grief and regret. Your mother always said I should have followed my passion instead of just chasing security. She was right. Michael set down his phone, giving his father his full attention for the first time in months. If you're serious about this, you need a real plan. You can't just buy a vineyard on sentiment and hope it works out. The listing says the property needs extensive restoration. The vines have been neglected for years. You'd need capital for equipment, for hiring experts, for covering losses while you build the business. Do you even know how to make wine? No, Daniel said, but I know how to learn. And I know how to analyze systems and optimize processes. Wine is chemistry and timing and quality control. I spent 25 years managing complex operations. I can figure this out. The conversation with Rebecca went differently. She met him at her apartment in San Francisco, a tiny studio in the Mission District that smelled of coffee and old books. She poured them both generous glasses of a Napa Cabernet and listened without interrupting as Daniel explained his plan. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in her glass, watching the light catch in the deep garnet liquid. This is Grandpa's dream, isn't it? She finally said. The one he gave up when Vincent disappeared. I think so. And you want to finish what he started. I want to find out why he gave up. I want to understand what happened to Vincent Castellano. And yes, I want to make wine. I want to build something that matters, something that will outlive me. I spent my whole career building value for shareholders who didn't know my name. I want to create something with my own hands. Rebecca smiled and Daniel saw Jennifer in the curve of her daughter's mouth, the warmth in her eyes. Then you have to do it, Dad. You have to go all in. No backup plans, no safety nets. That's how you honor Grandpa's dream. That's how you make Mom proud. The next morning, Daniel called his bank and arranged to have $600,000 available for the auction. It was every liquid asset he possessed, everything he had to show for 3 decades of financial prudence. Michael's warnings echoed in his mind, all the rational reasons this was a mistake. But Rebecca's words carried more weight. No backup plans, no safety nets. The 2 weeks before the auction passed in a blur of research and preparation. Daniel drove to Napa Valley 3 times, parking on the road outside the Castellano estate gates, studying the property from a distance. The Victorian manor house sat at the crest of a gentle slope, its ornate gables and wraparound porch speaking of an era when craftsmanship mattered more than efficiency. The paint had faded to a ghostly gray, and several shutters hung at drunken angles. But the bones of the structure looked sound. The vineyard spread across the hillside in neat rows, the vines gnarled and ancient, winter bare but somehow still vital, waiting for spring to call them back to life. On his 3rd visit, an old pickup truck pulled up beside Daniel's rental car. A man in his 80s climbed out slowly, arthritis making each movement deliberate. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. You thinking about bidding on the old place? The man asked, his voice carrying the rasp of a lifetime of cigarettes. Maybe, Daniel said. Did you know Vincent Castellano? The old man's eyes narrowed. Knew him? I worked for him. 30 years as his vineyard manager before the Whitmores ran everything into the ground. You ask anyone who was around in the 60s, they'll tell you Vincent Castellano was the finest winemaker California ever produced. The reserve he made in '65? That wasn't just wine. That was proof that we could compete with Bordeaux, with Burgundy, with any vineyard in the world. Then he disappeared, and everything good disappeared with him. What happened to him? The old man looked out over the vineyard, and something like pain crossed his weathered face. Official story? He walked away from his debts, abandoned everything. But Vincent Castellano didn't run from nothing. He was excited about the '68 vintage, said it was going to be even better than the '65. Then Gerald Whitmore started coming around more often, asking questions about Vincent's processes, his formulas. There were arguments. I heard them shouting in the cellar one night. Week later, Vincent was gone. Gerald claimed sole ownership of the estate, ran it for another 20 years, but he never made anything worth drinking. When he died, his son took over, and when he died, the grandson got it. Each generation worse than the last. Now it's foreclosed, and good riddance. Do you think Gerald Whitmore had something to do with Vincent's disappearance? The old man met Daniel's gaze directly. I think powerful men don't like being told no. I think Vincent discovered something that threatened Gerald's interests. And I think the truth has been buried here for 56 years, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to dig it up. He climbed back into his truck without another word, leaving Daniel standing in the January cold with more questions than answers. The morning of the auction arrived gray and bitter, the kind of Northern California winter day that makes you forget the sun ever existed. Daniel drove to the Napa County Courthouse alone, despite Michael's offer to accompany him. This decision, this leap into the unknown, felt like something he needed to face on his own terms. The courthouse steps were already crowded when he arrived, 40 or 50 people gathered in clusters, their breath misting in the cold air. Daniel recognized several faces from his research. Local real estate speculators, developers, a few people who might have been wine enthusiasts hoping for a bargain. And then there was Preston Whitmore. Daniel had studied the man's photograph online, but in person, Preston Whitmore radiated a kind of casual menace that no image could capture. He stood apart from the crowd, flanked by two assistants in expensive suits, checking his phone with the bored confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. 62 years old, CEO of Whitmore Wine Estates, heir to the empire his grandfather had built on the ruins of Vincent Castellano's dream. The Whitmore holdings sprawled across 4,000 acres of prime Napa Valley land, producing wines that won awards and commanded premium prices in restaurants across America. Why would a man who owned an empire bother with 80 neglected acres? The auctioneer mounted the courthouse steps at precisely 10 o'clock. An efficient-looking woman in her 50s who projected the weariness of someone who spent her days liquidating people's broken dreams. She outlined the terms in a flat monotone. Cash or verified financing only. 10% deposit due immediately upon winning bid. Closing within 45 days. Property sold as is with no warranties expressed or implied. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here for the public auction of the property known as Castellano Estate Vineyard. 80 acres with Victorian manor house, winery building, cellars, and established vines. Due to foreclosure proceedings, bidding will start at $220,000. Do I have $220,000? Daniel raised his numbered paddle, hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The auctioneer acknowledged him with a nod. $220,000 from bidder 42. Do I hear $250,000? A local developer raised his paddle. The auctioneer's rhythm accelerated, numbers climbing in practiced increments. $280,000, $300,000, $320,000. At each level, Daniel raised his paddle, committed now, the point of no return somewhere back in the rearview mirror. Michael's voice echoed in his head, all the rational warnings, but Daniel pushed them aside. This was about more than logic. This was about honoring the dreams his grandfather had abandoned. This was about discovering whether he had anything left to build his life around besides grief. At $450,000, most of the casual bidders dropped out. Daniel's heart was hammering now. He could go to $600,000, but after that, he'd be out. The developer shook his head and lowered his paddle. That left Daniel and Preston Whitmore, and one other bidder Daniel hadn't noticed before. A representative from Silverstone Development, a company Daniel's research had identified as specializing in converting agricultural land into luxury resorts and casinos. The kind of development that would bulldoze heritage vines to pour concrete for swimming pools and poker tables. $500,000. Daniel bid. $550,000. Preston Whitmore, barely looking up from his phone. $600,000. The Silverstone representative, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone executing orders from corporate headquarters. Daniel's throat tightened. He was at his limit. Every dollar he possessed in the world, and it wasn't enough. The dream was slipping away before he'd even had a chance to fight for it. $600,000 from Silverstone Development. Do I hear $650,000? Preston Whitmore studied Daniel for a long moment, something calculating in his expression, then raised his paddle. $650,000. The auctioneer looked at the Silverstone representative, who was speaking urgently into his phone, presumably seeking authorization for a higher bid. Daniel felt the loss settling into his bones. the familiar weight of dreams deferred, of paths not taken. This was how life worked. You reached for something meaningful, and the universe reminded you that meaningful things belong to people with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. Then everything changed. A voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, cultured and commanding, with the faint trace of an accent that might have been British or might have been the product of expensive boarding schools. $2 million. The crowd turned as one, and Daniel saw a man he would later come to know as Harrison Blackwell. 76 years old, dressed in tweeds that would have looked ridiculous on anyone else but on him, suggested old money and older secrets. He leaned on a walking cane made of dark wood, his silver hair precisely combed, his eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. He held no paddle, hadn't registered as a bidder, but the auctioneer recognized him immediately. "Mr. Blackwell, I'll need to see verification of funds before I can accept that bid." Harrison produced a letter from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with deliberate care and handing it to the auctioneer. She scanned it, and Daniel saw her eyebrows rise. She nodded, and the murmur in the crowd grew louder. Preston Whitmore's face had gone the color of old ash. $2.2 million, he said, his voice tight. Harrison didn't hesitate. $2.5 million. Final offer. The silence that followed felt alive, electric, with possibility and threat. Preston Whitmore stared at Harrison Blackwell with something that looked like recognition, and beneath that, fear. The auctioneer waited, her gavel raised. $2.5 million going once, going twice. Preston's jaw worked, but no words came. Whatever Harrison Blackwell represented, whatever history lay between them, it was enough to make a man who owned an empire back down. The gavel fell with a crack like a gunshot. Sold to Mr. Harrison Blackwell for $2.5 million. Daniel stood frozen as the crowd began to disperse. His dream, his chance at redemption, had just been purchased by a stranger for 4 times what the property was worth. He should leave. There was nothing for him here now. But as he turned toward the parking lot, a hand touched his elbow. A young woman, mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal suit that screamed personal assistant to someone important. "Mr. Brennan, Mr. Blackwell would like a word, if you have a moment. He's invited you to lunch at French Laundry. His car is waiting." Daniel's first instinct was to refuse, to salvage what dignity remained and walk away clean. But curiosity, that old enemy, that old friend, had its hooks in him now. "Why me?" Daniel asked. The assistant smiled. "Mr. Blackwell has been very interested in your interest in Castellano Estate. He'd like to discuss a proposition." The drive to French Laundry took 20 minutes through the heart of Napa Valley, past vineyards that wore their winter dormancy like elegant undress, waiting for spring to call them back to abundance. The restaurant occupied a restored stone building in Yountville, one of those places where reservations required months of planning and connections Daniel didn't possess. But Harrison Blackwell's name opened doors that remained closed to ordinary mortals. They were shown to a private dining room, just the two of them, with windows overlooking a garden where herbs grew in careful rows. Harrison ordered for them both without consulting a menu, a quiet assumption of authority that should have been offensive, but somehow wasn't. "You're wondering why I brought you here," Harrison said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chose words carefully. "And more importantly, why I just spent $2.5 million on a property that's probably worth less than $1 million in its current condition." "The thought had crossed my mind," Daniel said. "I know who you are, Mr. Brennan." "Daniel. May I call you Daniel? I know you spent 25 years as CFO at Axiom Technologies. I know you retired early after your wife's death. I know your grandfather worked at Castellano Estate from 1950 until Vincent disappeared in 1968. I know you've been researching the property for 3 weeks, driving up from Palo Alto to sit outside the gates like a man trying to remember something he's forgotten." Daniel's spine straightened. "You've been having me followed. I've been paying attention. There's a difference. I've been tracking Castellano Estate for 40 years, waiting for the foreclosure, waiting for the moment when it would finally come up for sale. Your appearance complicated things, but it also presented an opportunity. The first course arrived, something delicate and perfectly composed that Daniel barely registered. His appetite had vanished, replaced by a thrumming anticipation. What kind of opportunity? Harrison set down his fork, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I want to restore Castellano Estate to its former glory. I want to recreate Vincent Castellano's legendary reserve wine, and I want you to be the one who does it." Daniel laughed. a short bark of disbelief. I'm not a winemaker. I'm a CFO. I can read a balance sheet and optimize a supply chain, but I've never made wine in my life. But you understand systems, Harrison said. You understand process and quality control. You understand how to take complex variables and synthesize them into consistent outcomes. Wine is chemistry and timing and attention to detail. It's managing risk and optimizing for quality over quantity. These are things you've spent your entire career mastering, just in a different context. Why not hire an actual winemaker? Because winemakers are artists, and artists are temperamental. They follow their instincts, their passion, their ego. What I need is someone who can think analytically, who can study Vincent's methods and replicate them with precision. Someone who has something to prove, a reason to succeed beyond just collecting a paycheck. You have all of that, Daniel, and more importantly, you have a connection to this place. Through your grandfather, through your own hunger for purpose. That kind of motivation can't be hired. The proposition came with the second course. Harrison would retain ownership of the property, but Daniel would operate as master vintner and managing partner. A 10-year partnership, with Daniel holding 30% equity. After 5 years, Daniel would have the option to purchase a controlling 51% stake at a predetermined price. Harrison's foundation would provide $1.2 million in restoration capital. Daniel would contribute his expertise and labor. The goal, the obsession that had driven Harrison for 4 decades, was singular: recreate the legendary Castellano Reserve wine. Why do you care so much about this? Daniel asked. About a wine that hasn't existed for 60 years? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Because I knew Vincent Castellano. Because I owe him a debt I can never fully repay. And because some truths deserve to be resurrected no matter how long they've been buried. Before Daniel could press for details, the dining room door opened and Preston Whitmore walked in uninvited. His face was flushed, whether from anger or the cold outside, Daniel couldn't tell. He ignored Daniel completely, focusing all his attention on Harrison. "You're making a mistake, old man," Preston said, his voice low and dangerous. "That property should have been mine. My family has a right to it." "Your family lost any rights they had when your grandfather destroyed everything Vincent built," Harrison replied, his tone remaining calm but acquiring an edge like frost on glass. "Gerald Whitmore was a parasite who fed on genius he couldn't comprehend. I won't allow his grandson to finish the job. You don't know what you're getting into. Leave the past buried. That's my only warning." "I don't respond well to warnings, Preston. I never have." Preston's gaze finally shifted to Daniel, and in it, Daniel saw something that made his blood run cold. Not anger, not even hatred, just a kind of cold calculation, the look of a man deciding whether eliminating an obstacle was worth the trouble. "Think carefully about the company you keep, Mr. Brennan," Preston said. "The wine business has a way of destroying people who don't understand its dangers." Then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt like the aftermath of a storm. "What was that about?" Daniel asked. Harrison's expression had hardened, decades of carefully maintained composure cracking just enough to reveal something beneath. Anger, yes, but also grief, and a determination that bordered on obsession. "That was about the fact that Preston Whitmore knows I'm going to expose what his grandfather did, and he'll do whatever it takes to stop me." The drive back to Palo Alto gave Daniel hours to think. He should walk away. Whatever history existed between Harrison Blackwell and the Whitmore family, whatever secrets lay buried at Castellano Estate, they weren't his problem. He could return to his comfortable retirement, find something safe and sensible to do with his remaining years. That was the smart choice, the rational choice. But rationality had given him 25 years of building someone else's empire while his own dreams withered on the vine. Rationality had kept him safe and small and ultimately hollow. That night, Daniel called Michael and Rebecca. Conference call, the three of them connected across the miles. He explained the meeting with Harrison, the proposition, the veiled threat from Preston Whitmore. Michael's response was predictable. "Dad, this sounds like you're walking into someone else's war. You don't know these people. You don't know what they're really after." But Rebecca's voice cut through her brother's concern. "What did Grandpa tell you about wine, Dad, before he stopped talking about it?" Daniel closed his eyes, reaching back through decades to summers spent in his grandfather's small backyard, listening to stories told in broken English, flavored with the music of Italian vowels. He said that wine was truth made visible, that you couldn't fake great wine any more than you could fake love or courage, that the soil remembered everything, and if you were patient enough, it would tell you its secrets. Then you have to do this, Rebecca said. You have to find out what the soil remembers. You have to finish what Grandpa started. Michael sighed, and Daniel heard the sound of surrender in it. If you're doing this, you're not doing it alone. I'll take a leave of absence from the firm. You need a CFO who actually knows what he's doing to manage the business side while you figure out the winemaking. 6 months. That's all I can commit to right now. Daniel felt something crack open in his chest, some calcified shell around his heart that had formed in the years since Jennifer died. His children believed in him. More than that, they were willing to risk their own security to help him chase this impossible dream. Thank you, he managed, his voice rough. Don't thank us yet, Michael said. Thank us when we're drinking our own wine and not living in a Victorian house with no heat and questionable plumbing. The papers were signed 3 days later in Harrison's attorney's office in San Francisco. The partnership was official. Daniel Brennan, 58 years old, retired CFO, widower, father, grandfather's grandson, was now the managing partner of Castellano Estate Vineyard. He had 60 days to move in, assess the property, and begin the restoration. In his pocket was a cashier's check for $200,000, the first installment of Harrison's promised capital. In his mind were 1,000 questions, chief among them. What had Vincent Castellano discovered that was worth disappearing for? The first visit to the property as its new steward came on a morning when February rain had turned the valley into a study in gray and silver. Daniel met Harrison at the gates, where a caretaker was waiting with keys. The man was ancient, possibly 90, with skin like old leather and eyes that had seen things they'd chosen not to speak about. This is Thomas, Harrison said. He's been looking after the property since the foreclosure, keeping the vandals out, making sure the structure doesn't collapse completely. Thomas knew Vincent. The old caretaker studied Daniel with an intensity that felt like judgment. You look like your grandfather, he said finally. He was a good man, knew when to speak and when to stay silent. You'll need to learn the difference if you're going to survive what's buried here. They walked the property for 3 hours, Harrison explaining his vision while Daniel took notes and photographs. The manor house was larger than he'd realized from the road, 12 rooms spread across 3 floors, with original hardwood floors and crown molding that spoke of an era when craftsmanship was its own reward. The furniture remained covered in dust sheets, as if Vincent had expected to return at any moment. In the library, Daniel found shelves of wine books dating back to the 1800s. Their leather spines cracked, but their pages still intact. The master bedroom felt like a shrine. Vincent's personal effects remained untouched. A watch on the nightstand, reading glasses beside a lamp, a photograph on the dresser showing a handsome man in his 40s standing in the vineyard, his expression combining pride and something else. Wariness, perhaps, or fear. He knew, Harrison said quietly, standing in the doorway. In those last months, Vincent knew someone was coming for him. He just didn't know when. They moved to the vineyard itself, 80 acres of old-growth vines that had somehow survived decades of neglect. The Cabernet Sauvignon vines were 60 years old, their trunks thick as a man's forearm, their root systems delving deep into soil that held the memory of every vintage they'd produced. Mixed among them were smaller plantings of Merlot, Petit Verdot, and something Daniel didn't recognize. What are those? He asked, pointing to a small block in the northeast corner. Zinfandel, Harrison said. Very old growth, possibly pre-prohibition. Vincent used small amounts in his reserve blend, 5% according to the old tasting notes. It gave the wine a complexity that the Bordeaux varieties alone couldn't achieve. The winery building was a beautiful wreck, its stone walls solid but its roof compromised, its fermentation tanks vintage 1960s, but potentially functional with restoration. The barrel room could hold 200 French oak barrels, though most were empty now, their staves dried and cracked from years without wine to keep them moist. But it was the cellar that stopped Daniel's breath. They descended worn stone steps into perfect darkness, the air temperature dropping 20 degrees in the span of 10 feet. Thomas found the electrical panel and threw a switch, and ancient bulbs flickered to life, revealing a space that seemed to exist outside of time. The underground cellar extended in multiple directions, carved from natural limestone, the temperature and humidity naturally controlled by the cave system that honeycombed the hillside. Wine racks lined the walls, designed to hold 10,000 bottles, but now almost entirely empty. Vincent built this himself, Harrison said, his voice echoing off stone walls. Spent 5 years excavating, reinforcing, perfecting the conditions. He understood that great wine needed time, darkness, perfect stillness. This cellar was his cathedral. Daniel walked slowly through the space, his footsteps hollow on the stone floor. His architect's mind analyzing the engineering, the precision of the construction. In the far corner, he noticed something odd. The dust pattern on the floor showed disturbance, as if something heavy had been moved recently. He followed the track to a wine rack that looked identical to all the others, but the dust around its base was thinner. "Has anyone been down here?" Daniel asked. Thomas and Harrison exchanged glances. "Not that I know of," Thomas said. "I checked the locks weekly, no signs of break-in." Daniel studied the rack more carefully. The wood was old, hand-joined, beautiful in its simplicity, but when he pressed against it, he felt movement. He pushed harder, and the entire rack swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a small door with a combination lock. Harrison's breath caught. My God, he actually built it. Vincent told me once when I was young that every winemaker needs a secret room, a place to keep the formulas, the notes, the experiments that aren't ready for the world. I thought he was speaking metaphorically. The combination lock was old, the kind that required 4 numbers. Daniel tried the obvious, 1965, the year of the legendary reserve. The lock didn't budge. He tried Vincent's birth year, 1920. Nothing. Then, on instinct, he tried his grandfather's birth year, 1928. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward, revealing a chamber perhaps 12 feet square. And in that moment, as Daniel crossed the threshold into Vincent Castellano's hidden room, he understood that everything he thought he knew about this property, about his grandfather's stories, about the sanitized history of California wine, was about to be rewritten. The room was a time capsule, perfectly preserved. A desk sat against one wall, still covered with papers, notebooks, letters. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with leather-bound journals. A filing cabinet occupied a third wall, its drawers partially open, as if Vincent had left in a hurry. But it was the wall facing the door that made Daniel's heart hammer in his chest. The entire surface was covered with documents, photographs, hand-drawn maps, all connected by lines of string, like something from a detective's investigation board. Faces stared out from old photographs. Financial ledgers were tacked up beside handwritten notes. And everywhere, circled in red ink, was one name: Gerald Whitmore. On the desk, arranged as if for someone to find, were 12 bottles of wine, hand-labeled, the ink faded but still legible. Castellano Reserve 1965, formula complete. Beside the bottles lay a leather-bound journal, and when Daniel opened it to the last entry, his hands were shaking. October 14th, 1968. I've documented everything. The fraud, the counterfeit operation, the blood money flowing through Gerald's accounts from Chicago. He's threatened my family, threatened to destroy everything I've built if I go to the authorities. I've hidden the physical evidence in the caves beneath Block 7, where only someone who truly understands this land will find it. The wine tells the story. The soil remembers. If I disappear, the truth is here, waiting for someone brave enough to unearth it. God forgive me for not being braver when it mattered. Vincent Castellano. Daniel looked up at Harrison, whose face had gone pale. What did Vincent discover? Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. The truth that got him killed. Outside, the February rain continued to fall, washing over vines that had kept their vigil for 56 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions, to open the right doors, to finally bring the buried past into the unforgiving light of day. Daniel Brennan had come to Napa Valley looking for purpose, for a way to honor his grandfather's abandoned dreams, for something to fill the hollow space Jennifer's death had carved in his life. Instead, he had found a mystery that reached back through decades, roots that went deeper than any vine, and a truth that powerful men had killed to keep hidden. The restoration of Castellano Estate Vineyard was no longer just about making wine. It was about justice deferred, secrets long buried, and the dangerous proposition that some stories demand to be told no matter the cost. In his pocket, Daniel's phone buzzed, a text from Michael. Moving truck booked for next week. Rebecca's coming too. Whatever this is, We're in it together. Daniel stood in Vincent Castellano's hidden room, surrounded by evidence of crimes and cover-ups, holding a journal written by a dead man, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not hope, exactly. Something harder. Something more like purpose sharpened to a blade's edge. The rain fell. The vines waited. And somewhere in the darkness, the truth began its long, slow climb toward the light. The notebooks filled 3 cardboard boxes, their pages yellowed but still legible. Vincent Castellano's handwriting precise and methodical. The script of a man who understood that details mattered, that precision separated genius from mere competence. Daniel sat at the desk in the hidden room, the stone walls pressing close around him, and read by the light of a single lamp he'd brought down from the manor house. Outside, March rain drummed against the earth, but here, 30 feet below ground, the only sound was the whisper of turning pages and the occasional drip of water from ancient limestone. Harrison sat across from him, reading a different journal, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. Thomas, the old caretaker, had returned to his cottage on the property's edge, but not before saying something that lodged in Daniel's mind like a splinter. Vincent knew they were coming for him. Last time I saw him, he said, "Tell no one what you've seen. Some truths are worth dying for, but not worth getting your family killed over." I've kept that silence for 56 years. Maybe it's time it ended. The story that emerged from Vincent's journals was methodical in its documentation, damning in its implications. Vincent Castellano had arrived in Napa Valley in 1950, an Italian immigrant with old-world techniques and new-world ambitions. He partnered with Gerald Whitmore in 1955, a marriage of winemaking artistry and business acumen that seemed destined for greatness. Vincent provided the genius, the instinct for blending, the patience to wait for grapes to reach their perfect moment. Gerald provided capital, distribution networks, connections to restaurants and retailers who could move premium wine at premium prices. For a decade, it worked. Castellano Estate produced excellent wines that built a solid reputation. Then, in 1965, Vincent created something transcendent. The Castellano Reserve that year was unlike anything California had produced before. Wine critics struggled for adequate language. The depth, the complexity, the way it evolved in the glass, revealing new facets with each passing minute. It sold for $500 a bottle, and demand far exceeded the 1,000 cases they'd produced. But that success, that recognition, became the seed of everything that followed. According to the journals, Gerald Whitmore saw opportunity where Vincent saw art. The Reserve had established a ceiling for what Napa wine could command. If they could replicate that success, scale it up, they could build an empire. But Vincent refused. The 65 vintage was special because of specific conditions that year. The interplay of weather and soil and timing that couldn't be forced or rushed. Great wine required patience. It required accepting that some years would produce greatness and others merely excellence. Gerald didn't want to wait. He wanted to capitalize on the moment, to flood the market with Reserve while the acclaim was fresh, while restaurants were clamoring for allocation, while collectors were willing to pay astronomical sums for a taste of California's finest. The journals from 1967 showed the partnership fracturing. Vincent discovered that Gerald had purchased cheap bulk wine from other vineyards, bottled it under the Castellano Reserve label, and sold it at premium prices. When Vincent confronted him, Gerald's defense was simple. The customers couldn't tell the difference. The wine critics couldn't tell the difference. Only Vincent's precious palate and overblown sense of artistic integrity stood between them and millions of dollars in profit. Vincent threatened to go public, to expose the fraud, to destroy the Castellano Estate brand rather than see it perverted into a lie. Gerald's response, documented in a letter Vincent had photographed and hidden, was chilling in its casual menace. "You'll do no such thing. I have friends, Vincent, important friends who've invested in our success, friends who don't like being embarrassed, friends who've made problems disappear before. Think about your family. Think about whether your pride is worth their safety." The friends Gerald referenced became clearer as Daniel read deeper into the journals. Photographs showed Gerald at restaurants in San Francisco, sitting with men whose names appeared in organized crime investigations. Bank records showed money flowing through Castellano Estate from sources that had nothing to do with wine sales. Deposits that matched almost exactly the known proceeds from illegal gambling operations, from loan sharking, from the various enterprises that Italian and Irish mobs ran in California's cities during the 1960s. Gerald Whitmore wasn't just counterfeiting wine. He was laundering money for organized crime, using the vineyard as a front for washing dirty cash into legitimate business income. And Vincent had documented everything. Daniel looked up from the journal he was reading, his mind reeling with implications. This is evidence of federal crimes, wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering. Why didn't Vincent go to the FBI? Harrison's voice was heavy with old grief, because he knew what happened to informants in those days. The mob didn't just kill you, they killed your family, made examples. Vincent had a daughter, Sarah. She was 16 in 1968. He chose her safety over justice. But he kept all this evidence. Why? Insurance maybe, or faith that someday, when it was safe, the truth would matter. Vincent believed in eventual justice. He believed the soil remembered everything, and eventually what was buried would surface. Daniel stood, pacing the small room, trying to process what he discovered. His grandfather had worked here during all of this. Had he known? Is that why he'd left so abruptly? Why he'd never spoken of those years? Why he'd taken a job canning fruit rather than ever touching wine again? The answer came in a separate journal, one marked with his grandfather's name. Inside, a letter, never sent, written in Vincent's careful script. My dear friend Antonio, by the time you read this, I will likely be gone. Gerald has made his intentions clear. I have refused to destroy the evidence, and he will not allow me to keep breathing with such knowledge in my head. I have hidden the physical proof in the caves beneath Block 7. The entrance is concealed, but you know the land as well as I do. You'll find it if you look. I ask only this. Protect Sarah. She knows nothing of any of this. Keep her ignorant, keep her safe. The truth can wait. Some things matter more. Your friend always, Vincent. Daniel's hands trembled, holding the letter. His grandfather had known, had been entrusted with the location of evidence that could have brought Gerald Whitmore to justice. But Antonio Brennan had chosen the same path Vincent chose. Silence. Safety. He'd taken his granddaughter to Mass every Sunday, worked his shifts at the cannery, died without ever speaking of the friend who disappeared, the secret he'd carried, the cowardice or wisdom that had kept him quiet. We need to find Block 7, Daniel said. We need to find whatever Vincent hid there. Harrison nodded slowly, but carefully. If Preston Whitmore suspects we're looking for something specific, he'll escalate. The vandalism, the threats, they've been probing so far. Testing our resolve. If he knows we're close to evidence that could destroy his family's legacy, he'll do more than threaten. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel threw himself into understanding the property with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He hired Maria Santos, a 40-year-old vineyard manager with 15 years of experience in Napa Valley, to assess the vines and develop a rehabilitation plan. She walked the rows with the careful attention of a surgeon examining a patient, her experienced eyes cataloging decades of neglect and the stubborn vitality that had kept the old vines alive despite abandonment. These Cabernet vines are 60 years old, she said, kneeling beside a gnarled trunk in Block 7, the northeast corner where old-growth Zinfandel mixed with the Bordeaux varieties. The root system goes down 30 feet, maybe more. They've survived drought, disease, neglect. That kind of resilience produces grapes with incredible concentration. If we can nurse them back to health, give them proper nutrition and water management, this vineyard could produce world-class fruit. Michael arrived with a moving truck filled with furniture from Daniel's old house, the pieces that hadn't sold, the items too laden with memory to discard, but too painful to live among. Together, father and son spent a weekend transforming the manor house from museum to home. Michael set up an office in what had been Vincent's study, installing modern technology amid century-old architecture, the juxtaposition jarring but somehow appropriate. Spreadsheets and financial projections glowed on laptop screens beneath crown molding, hand-carved in 1889. Rebecca came the following week, her sommelier's palate and wine educator's knowledge immediately valuable. She organized the library, cataloging Vincent's collection of wine books, creating a database of his tasting notes and blending experiments. She found formulas for wines that had never been made, ideas Vincent had been developing, innovations that were decades ahead of their time. Look at this, she said one evening. showing Daniel a notebook filled with chemical equations and fermentation charts. Vincent was experimenting with micro-oxygenation in the 1960s. That technique wasn't widely adopted until the 1990s. He was using computer modeling to predict how wines would age. He had access to a university mainframe and was running simulations. This man was a scientist as much as an artist. The 12 bottles of Castellano Reserve 1965 from the hidden room went to UC Davis for analysis. The wine science department treated them like archaeological artifacts, which in a sense they were. When the results came back 3 weeks later, Rebecca called a family meeting in the Manor House library. "The analysis is impossible," she said, spreading the lab reports across the desk. "According to these results, the wine shows chemical markers that shouldn't exist in a 1965 vintage. The micro-oxygenation signatures, the specific tannin structure, the phenolic development. These markers match modern techniques that weren't invented until the 1990s. Daniel leaned forward, his CFO brain engaging with the puzzle. "Which means what? The bottles aren't from 1965? Or Vincent was so far ahead of his time that he invented techniques independently that the rest of the wine world wouldn't discover for another 30 years. Look at the blend analysis. 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, 25% Merlot, 10% Petit Verdot, 5% Old Growth Zinfandel. That's a perfect modern cult wine formula. But in 1965, nobody was blending like this. The conventional wisdom was all Cabernet or nothing." Harrison had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old knowledge, finally given voice. "Vincent told me once that he saw winemaking as a science that had been practiced as folk art for too long. He said that if you understood the chemistry, the biology, the physics of fermentation and aging, you could replicate excellence with the precision of mathematics. Everyone thought he was being grandiose. But what if he was right? What if he really had cracked the code?" The implications hung in the air like the dust motes visible in the library's afternoon light. If Vincent had developed a formula for creating world-class wine with scientific precision, that knowledge was worth millions. And if Gerald Whitmore had killed to prevent Vincent from revealing the counterfeiting operation, how much more would he have killed for the formula itself? Daniel's phone rang, shattering the contemplative silence. Sheriff Tom Henderson's name appeared on the screen. Daniel stepped into the hallway to take the call, and the sheriff's words came fast and urgent. "Mr. Brennan, we've had a break-in at your property. The main gates were forced sometime last night. We're on site now, but you should get down here." Daniel drove the half-mile from the manor house to the main entrance with his heart hammering. 3 sheriff's vehicles blocked the driveway, their lights painting the afternoon in alternating blue and red. Sheriff Henderson met him at the gates, a stocky man in his 50s, whose weathered face suggested he'd seen too much rural crime to be easily surprised. But something about this had rattled him. "They didn't steal anything," Henderson said without preamble. "Didn't vandalize the buildings. But they searched the property thoroughly. We found evidence of entry in the manor house, the winery building, and the cellar. Professional job. No forced locks, no broken windows. They had keys or picks good enough to leave no marks. What were they looking for? That's what concerns me. This wasn't random. This was targeted. Someone wanted to know what you have, what you found. Do you have any idea what that might be?" Daniel's mind raced. The hidden room, Vincent's journals, the evidence of fraud and money laundering. If Preston Whitmore knew they'd discovered the room, knew they had documentation of his grandfather's crimes, he'd want to know exactly what evidence existed, how much of a threat it posed. "I need to check something," Daniel said, moving past the sheriff toward his car. The drive back to the manor house took 90 seconds that felt like 90 minutes. Daniel descended into the cellar, Harrison and Michael close behind him. The hidden room's door stood open, the combination lock hanging loose. Someone had bypassed it with the efficient brutality of a professional locksmith. Inside, the room looked untouched at first glance, but Daniel knew immediately that it had been searched. The notebooks were stacked too neatly. The filing cabinet drawers, which Vincent had left partially open, were now completely closed. The desk surface had been wiped clean of the fine layer of dust that had covered everything. "They photographed everything," Harrison said quietly, pointing to small scratches on the floor where a camera tripod had stood. "They didn't take the evidence because that would alert us to what they know. But now they have copies of every document, every journal, every photograph Vincent left behind. Michael's face had gone pale, which means they know we have evidence of Gerald Whitmore's crimes. They know we can prove the counterfeiting, the money laundering, everything. More than that, Daniel said, a cold certainty settling over him. They know we're looking for something more, for whatever Vincent hid in Block 7, and they're going to be looking for it too. The following morning, Daniel assembled his small team in the winery building. Maria Santos with her knowledge of viticulture, Rebecca with her understanding of wine science, Michael with his business acumen, Harrison with his decades of research into the Castellano mystery. And joining them now, at Harrison's insistence, was Jean-Paul Rousseau, a 60-year-old French winemaker with a reputation for resurrecting forgotten vineyards and recreating lost wines. Jean-Paul walked the property with the careful attention of a man reading a story written in wood and soil. He studied the vines, tasted the earth, examined the aspect and drainage of each block. When he finally spoke, his accent carried the music of Bordeaux and the weight of 40 years making wine in France, Chile, and California. These vines have stories to tell. The old Cabernet in Block 3, they remember 1965. Their root system, their wood, they carry the genetic memory of that vintage. If we can restore their health, give them what they need, they will produce fruit capable of greatness. But the Zinfandel in Block 7, this is something different. These vines are older, maybe 80 years, pre-Prohibition plantings. This was Vincent's secret ingredient, yes? Daniel nodded. 5% of the reserve blend. According to his notes, the old Zinfandel provided a complexity that the Bordeaux varieties alone couldn't achieve. And Block 7 is where he hid his evidence, Jean-Paul said, not a question but a statement. A man who understood wine understood metaphor. He hid his truth where the truth of the soil was oldest, deepest, most profound. Over the next week, they conducted a methodical survey of Block 7. Ground-penetrating radar revealed what the old maps had hinted at: a network of natural limestone caves running beneath the vineyard, carved by water over millennia. The entrance Vincent had used was well hidden, collapsed sometime in the decades since his disappearance, but the cave system itself remained intact. Excavating the entrance required careful work. They couldn't use heavy machinery without risking damage to the vines or alerting observers to what they'd found. Instead, Daniel, Michael, and Jean-Paul spent long days with shovels and wheelbarrows, clearing away soil and rock by hand, working their way down to the stone lintel that marked where Vincent had entered the earth. On the fourth day of digging, they broke through. The smell hit them first: damp stone, mineral-rich earth, and underneath, something organic and faintly sweet: wine that had been sealed in darkness for over 50 years. They descended with flashlights and found themselves in a natural chamber, perhaps 30 feet across, the ceiling lost in shadows above them. The cave was perfect for wine storage, the temperature a constant 55 degrees, the humidity ideal for keeping corks moist and preventing oxidation. But it was what the cave contained that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. Wine bottles lined the walls, hundreds of them, each hand labeled in Vincent's precise script. Castellano Reserve, followed by various years from 1960 through 1968. An archive of every vintage Vincent had produced, hidden away where Gerald Whitmore could never reach them, where they could testify to what genuine Castellano Reserve tasted like versus the counterfeit swill Gerald had sold under the same label. In the center of the chamber sat a workbench, and on it, a large waterproof box. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were documents meticulously organized in folders, each labeled with dates and case numbers. Financial records showing the flow of mob money through Castellano estate. Photographs of Gerald meeting with known criminals. Wiretap transcripts that implicated not just Gerald, but dozens of his business associates in a network of fraud and racketeering. And beneath all of that, a separate envelope addressed in Vincent's handwriting: to whoever finds this. Daniel opened the envelope carefully, the paper crackling with age. Inside was a letter, written in the careful English of a man for whom the language was learned rather than native. If you have found this archive, then Gerald has likely succeeded in silencing me. I write this in September 1968, knowing that my time is running short. He has made explicit his intentions. I will not live to see another harvest, but the truth will outlive both of us. Everything you need to prove Gerald's crimes is here: the counterfeit operation, the laundering scheme, the connections to organized crime. Take this evidence to the FBI. Let the law decide his fate. But I ask one thing: protect my daughter Sarah. She knows nothing of any of this. Let her live free of this shadow. The wine will speak for itself. Compare what is in these caves to what Gerald sold under my name, and you will know the full extent of his betrayal. May God grant you the courage I lacked. Vincent Castellano, September 15th, 1968. 1 month before his disappearance. Vincent had known, had prepared, had done everything except save his own life. Daniel looked at Michael and Jean-Paul, their faces illuminated by flashlight beams, and saw his own shock reflected back. They had come looking for evidence of a 56-year-old fraud. What they'd found was documentation of organized crime connections that could rewrite the history of California wine, expose corruption that might still have living participants, and potentially put them all in the crosshairs of people who'd proven willing to kill to keep these secrets buried. "We need to call the FBI," Michael said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "This is way beyond anything we can handle on our own." But Daniel's mind was racing ahead to implications, to questions that needed answers. Vincent wrote this letter a month before he disappeared, but the bottles in here go all the way to 1968, which means he was still producing wine, still adding to this archive, right up until the end. These bottles aren't just evidence of Gerald's fraud. They're Vincent's legacy, his real work, the wine he made when he wasn't being forced to compromise. Jean-Paul had moved to examine the bottles, his experienced eye cataloging vintages and noting the perfect storage conditions. If these bottles have been kept in these conditions for over 50 years, they could still be viable, aged beyond anything available commercially. We could taste what Vincent Castellano really achieved, undiluted by Gerald's interference. Harrison spoke from the cave entrance, his voice carrying echoes off the limestone walls. "Before we bring in the FBI, before we open this to official investigation, we should document everything ourselves. Photograph every page, every bottle, every piece of evidence. Because once the authorities take control, we may never see any of this again. And more importantly, we should taste the wine. We should know what Vincent died protecting." That night in the Manor House dining room, they gathered around a table that had seen a century of meals. Jean-Paul had selected a bottle from the cave, Castellano Reserve 1965, carefully decanted, oiled, and let it breathe for 2 hours. Now he poured small amounts into crystal glasses that had belonged to Vincent, and they each held the deep garnet liquid up to the light. The wine was transcendent. Even after 56 years, it showed no signs of deterioration. Instead, it had developed layers of complexity that made modern wine seem crude by comparison. Dark fruit gave way to leather, tobacco, forest floor, with an underlying minerality that spoke of the limestone caves where it had aged. The finish lasted minutes, evolving in the mouth, revealing new facets with each passing second. Rebecca, with her trained palate, described what she tasted with the precision of a scientist and the passion of a convert. "This is perfect. The balance, the structure, the way every element integrates. I've tasted wines that cost thousands of dollars that can't approach this." Vincent wasn't just making wine. He was making art at a level that hasn't been matched since. Jean-Paul nodded slowly, his eyes closed as he savored the finish. "I have made wine in Bordeaux, in Napa, in Chile. I have tasted the great first growths, the cult wines that collectors fight over. This is beyond all of them. If we could recreate this, if we could understand Vincent's process well enough to honor his vision, we would produce something that would redefine what California wine can achieve." Daniel barely heard them. He was thinking about his grandfather, about the stories told in broken English, about a man who understood that wine was truth made visible. Antonio Brennan had tasted this wine, had known its quality, had watched Vincent create it. No wonder he'd never been able to speak of those years. How do you describe perfection to people who've never experienced it? How do you mourn a dream that died before it could be fully realized? The decision to contact the FBI came the next morning, but implementation proved more complex than anticipated. Sheriff Henderson connected them with FBI agent Carol Martinez from the San Francisco field office, a woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes and organized crime investigations. She arrived at Castellano Estate with 2 forensic accountants and a historian who specialized in California mob activity during the 1960s. Agent Martinez spent 3 days in the hidden room in the cave archive, photographing documents, taking statements, building the framework for what she described as potentially the largest cold case reopening in Northern California history. The evidence Vincent had compiled was meticulous, cross-referenced, and damning. Gerald Whitmore hadn't just laundered mob money. He'd been a key figure in a network that extended from San Francisco to Los Angeles, involving dozens of legitimate businesses used as fronts for illegal operations. Most of the principals are dead, Martinez explained, sitting across from Daniel in the Manor House study. Gerald Whitmore died in 1995. His mob contacts from the 1960s are either deceased or in their 90s, but his son Richard continued the operation through the 1980s and 90s, and Richard's son Preston has been running Whitmore Wine Estates since 2010. The question is, did the criminal activity continue across generations, or did Preston inherit a legitimate business built on dirty foundations? Preston has been threatening us since the auction, Daniel said. He's had the property searched. His people broke into the hidden room. That suggests he knows there's something to hide. Or he's protecting his family's reputation, Martinez countered. Legitimate concern about his grandfather's legacy being tarnished. We need evidence of contemporary criminal activity, not just historical crimes, to justify a full investigation of Preston Whitmore. The answer to that question came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the FBI began their investigation, Daniel received a visitor at the vineyard, a man in his 70s, thin as winter branches, with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, and he'd worked as an accountant for Whitmore Wine Estates from 1985 until his retirement in 2015. I saw the news coverage, Chen said, sitting in Daniel's office with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, about the FBI investigating Gerald Whitmore's connections to organized crime in the 1960s. And I thought maybe it's time. Maybe someone should know that it didn't end with Gerald. What Robert Chen revealed over the next 3 hours was a pattern of fraud that had continued, evolved, and expanded over 5 decades. Richard Whitmore had taken his father's counterfeiting operation and modernized it. Instead of just relabeling cheap wine, he'd developed relationships with bulk wine producers in South America, importing wine for pennies on the dollar, bottling it in Napa with prestigious labels, and selling it at premium prices. The profit margins were astronomical. Over 30 years, the scheme had generated more than $60 million in fraudulent revenue. And Preston, according to Chen, had not only known about the operation, but had expanded it when he took over. He'd added sophisticated money laundering through real estate investments, using the wine business profits to purchase properties throughout California, inflating their values through insider deals, and selling them at massive profits that generated clean money from dirty sources. Why didn't you report this earlier? Daniel asked. Chen's hands trembled. Because I was complicit. I helped structure the deals, helped hide the money. I told myself it was just aggressive business tactics, creative accounting. But I knew, I've always known. And when I saw that you'd found Vincent's evidence that someone was finally willing to challenge the Whitmores, I thought maybe I could redeem some small part of my soul before I die. Agent Martinez took Chen's statement personally, and within days, the investigation expanded dramatically. Federal warrants were issued for Whitmore Wine Estates' financial records. Forensic accountants descended on the company headquarters. Preston Whitmore hired a team of lawyers, and the case that had started with a 56-year-old murder was now a sprawling investigation into multi-generational fraud. Through it all, Daniel tried to focus on the work at hand. The vineyard needed attention. The vines were coming out of winter dormancy, buds beginning to swell with the promise of new growth. Maria Santos had developed a rehabilitation plan that would take 3 years to fully implement. But the first steps needed to happen now. Pruning, soil amendment, irrigation system repairs. The work was physical, grounding, a welcome distraction from the legal complexities swirling around them. Michael had fully embraced his role as the estate's CFO, working with Harrison's Foundation to manage the restoration capital, developing budgets for equipment purchases, negotiating with contractors for winery upgrades. Watching his son move through the property with purpose, Daniel felt a pride that had nothing to do with business success and everything to do with seeing Michael find meaning in work that mattered. Rebecca had become the estate's de facto historian, cataloging Vincent's research, organizing the wine library, preparing educational materials for the tasting room they planned to open. She'd also begun writing a book about Vincent Castellano, combining historical research with wine science, telling the story of a man whose genius was destroyed by greed, but whose legacy refused to stay buried. But it was the wine itself that dominated Daniel's thoughts. They had Vincent's formula, his techniques, his archive of perfect examples. Jean-Paul was confident they could recreate the Castellano Reserve, but doing so would require commitment to Vincent's vision of winemaking as science. It would require patience, precision, and the willingness to wait for conditions to be right rather than forcing production to meet market demands. The first real test came in late March when Preston Whitmore made an unexpected visit to the estate. His black Mercedes pulled up to the manor house without warning, and he emerged with two associates who stayed by the car, their presence a quiet threat. Daniel met him on the front porch, Harrison standing in the doorway behind him, and the two men regarded each other with the wariness of animals establishing territory. "You're making a mistake, Brennan," Preston said without preamble. "Digging up ancient history, feeding fantasies to the FBI about my grandfather. None of it will stick. He's been dead for 30 years. There's no one left to prosecute." "But there is someone to prosecute for the current fraud," Daniel replied. "For the counterfeiting operation that's been running continuously since your grandfather started it. For the money laundering that's still happening under your watch. That's not ancient history, Preston. That's ongoing criminal enterprise." Preston's face darkened. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. My family has built something real, something that employs hundreds of people, contributes millions to the local economy. You think you can destroy that because of some accountant's fantasy in a dead man's paranoid journal?" "I think the truth matters," Daniel said quietly. "I think Vincent Castellano died because he refused to compromise his integrity, and I think your family has spent 56 years profiting from his silence. That ends now." "Nothing ends until I say it ends," Preston said, and the naked threat in his voice was unmistakable. "You should remember that. Accidents happen in vineyards, equipment fails, old buildings catch fire. It would be tragic if something happened to this historical property you're trying so hard to restore." He left without waiting for a response, and Daniel stood on the porch watching the Mercedes disappear down the driveway, feeling the weight of what he'd taken on. This wasn't just about making wine anymore. It wasn't just about honoring his grandfather's memory or Vincent's legacy. He'd made an enemy of a man with resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to eliminate obstacles. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He walked the vineyard under a moon 3 days past full, the rows of vines casting shadows that looked like soldiers in formation. In Block 7, where the old Zinfandel grew, he stood among vines that had been planted before Prohibition, before World Wars, before any of the human drama that had unfolded above their roots. The vines didn't care about fraud or murder or family feuds. They simply endured, patient as stone, waiting for spring to call them back to their purpose. Daniel thought about Vincent walking these same rows, knowing his time was running out, choosing to document truth rather than save himself. He thought about his grandfather, carrying the weight of that knowledge for the rest of his life, the silence eating at him like acid. He thought about Jennifer, who'd always pushed him to find meaning beyond the next quarter's earnings, to build something that would outlast the spreadsheets and profit margins. And he made a decision. Whatever came, whatever threats Preston Whitmore made, whatever dangers lurked in the investigation of 56-year-old crimes, Daniel would see this through. He would restore Castellano Estate. He would recreate Vincent's wine. He would make sure the truth, which had waited so long in darkness, finally stood in light for all to see. The vines rustled in the night breeze, and Daniel imagined he could hear Vincent's voice in that sound, or maybe his grandfather's, or maybe just the land itself, telling him what it had known all along. That patience was rewarded, that truth endured, that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible and the enemies implacable. He walked back to the manor house as the moon set behind the western hills, and for the first time since Jennifer's death, Daniel Brennan felt something he'd thought lost forever. Not happiness, not yet, but purpose sharpened to clarity, and the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The investigation would continue. The threats would escalate. The challenges ahead would test everything he thought he knew about courage and commitment. But the vines were budding, the soil was ready, and somewhere in Vincent Castellano's journals and formulas, in 56 years of silent witness, lay the key to creating something that would justify every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. The truth was ready to be turned into wine, and Daniel Brennan intended to be the one who made it happen. The call came at 3 in the morning, the kind of hour when bad news arrives on silent feet. Daniel reached for his phone in the darkness of the manor house bedroom, his heart already racing before he saw Sheriff Henderson's name on the screen. The sheriff's voice was tight with controlled urgency, the tone of a man who'd seen something that violated the natural order of things. We found a body in the Quarry Lake off Highway 29, male, approximately 60 years, been in the water maybe a week. ID in his wallet says Anthony Castellano. That name mean anything to you? Daniel sat up, fully awake now, his mind racing through connections. Vincent had a daughter, Sarah. Anthony would be her son, Vincent's grandson. That's what we thought. Thing is, this doesn't look like an accident. The medical examiner found evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull before he went in the water. We're treating this as a homicide. And given your investigation into his grandfather's disappearance, I thought you should know. The news hit Daniel like a physical blow. Another Castellano, another generation, another death connected to secrets that refused to stay buried. He dressed quickly and drove to the sheriff's station as dawn broke over the valley, painting the vineyards in shades of gold and shadow. Agent Martinez was already there, her face grim, surrounded by case files and evidence photos spread across a conference table like tarot cards revealing a dark future. Anthony Castellano was a marine environmental researcher, Martinez explained, pulling up a file on her laptop. Worked independently, published papers on water quality, coastal ecology. Nothing that would obviously connect to wine fraud or organized crime. But 3 months ago, he started making inquiries. Called my office asking about cold cases involving the Castellano family. Called the Napa County Recorder's Office requesting property records for the original Castellano estate. 2 weeks before his death, he purchased geological survey maps of this area. She turned the laptop so Daniel could see. On the screen was an email draft, never sent, dated the day before Anthony's estimated time of death. The recipient was Harrison Blackwell. The subject line read, "I found what Grandpa Vincent hid. We need to talk." He knew about the caves, Daniel said quietly. He'd figured out where Vincent stored the evidence. But how? We only found them because we had access to Vincent's journals, the hidden room, all the documentation. Martinez pulled up another file. Anthony's mother, Sarah, died 2 years ago. According to her attorney, she left her son a safety deposit box that had been sealed since 1968. The bank records show Anthony accessed that box 3 months ago, right when he started his investigation. We got a warrant for the box contents. It was empty when we opened it, but the bank's entry log shows Anthony removed several items. A journal, some letters, and a small metal object the bank employee described as an old key. The pieces were falling into place with the inexorable logic of tragedy repeating across generations. Vincent had hidden evidence that could destroy Gerald Whitmore, but he'd also left clues for his daughter, insurance against the possibility that the truth might need to be resurrected someday. Sarah had kept those clues secret for 50 years, but on her deathbed, she'd passed them to her son. And Anthony, driven by the same hunger for truth that had killed his grandfather, had followed the trail to its deadly conclusion. "We need to see Anthony's research," Daniel said. "If he found the caves, if he documented what was there, that evidence might still exist somewhere." "His laptop was missing when we searched his apartment in Berkeley," Martinez said. "Whoever cleaned out the place took it. But we found something better. Anthony's mother had a storage unit in Oakland where she kept family belongings. Anthony had been using it as a secure location for backup drives. We found 3 external hard drives hidden in boxes of old photos. The encrypted files on those drives told us everything." She opened a folder on her laptop displaying recovered documents. Anthony had been methodical in his investigation, photographing the geological maps, documenting his research into the cave systems beneath Napa Valley, cross-referencing his grandfather's cryptic clues with modern terrain analysis. He'd figured out the location of the caves in Block 7 3 weeks before his death. His final notes, dated 2 days before he disappeared, indicated he planned to enter the caves to verify what was hidden there. "He never made it," Martinez said. "Someone found out what he was doing and stopped him permanently." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "We found the caves. We recovered all of Vincent's evidence. Whoever killed Anthony was trying to prevent exactly what we've already done." "Which means they failed," Martinez observed. "And that makes them desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, but they're also more dangerous." Over the following days, the FBI investigation expanded in scope and intensity. Forensic analysis of Anthony's body revealed he had been struck from behind with a blunt object, likely a wrench or tire iron, then placed in his car, which was pushed into the quarry lake. The intent was to make it look like an accident, a solo drive that ended tragically. But the medical examiner's careful work had revealed the truth. The investigation into Whitmore Wine Estates uncovered damning evidence. Gerald Whitmore's old storage unit, rented in 1975 and paid 50 years in advance, yielded original ledgers documenting every illegal transaction, every bribe, every connection to organized crime. The meticulous record-keeping that had helped Gerald avoid detection during his lifetime now became the evidence that would destroy his legacy. But the record stopped in 1995, the year Gerald died. Richard Whitmore, who took over the company, had been smarter about documentation. The paper trail from 1995 to 2010 was thin, though Robert Chen's testimony filled in many gaps. And after Richard's death in 2010, when Preston assumed control, the criminal enterprise had gone almost entirely digital. Preston's lawyers are good, Martinez told Daniel during one of their regular updates. They're arguing that he inherited a company with problematic history, but that he personally has committed no crimes. They're painting him as a reformer who was cleaning up his family's legacy when this investigation blindsided him. What about Anthony's murder? We can prove Anthony was investigating the Castellano case. We can prove he was killed, but we can't prove Preston ordered it or even knew about it. Unless we can find direct evidence connecting Preston to the murder or find someone willing to testify against him, the murder charges won't stick. The break they needed came from an unexpected direction. Thomas, the old caretaker at Castellano Estate, appeared at Daniel's office one morning with information that changed everything. "I saw something last night," Thomas said, his weathered face troubled. "A truck came up the old service road around midnight. Two men got out, spent maybe 2 hours in Block 7 with shovels, then left. I followed their tracks this morning." He led Daniel to the far corner of Block 7, where the oldest Zinfandel vines grew on a steep slope overlooking the valley. The soil had been recently disturbed, dug, and carelessly refilled. Daniel's stomach turned, knowing what they would find, before he called Sheriff Henderson, before the excavation equipment arrived, before the forensic team began their grim work. They found Richard Calloway 6 feet down, wrapped in plastic, a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. He'd been dead approximately 3 days, killed execution style, buried in the same vineyard where his employer's grandfather had hidden evidence that would ultimately destroy the family empire. Richard Calloway had been Preston Whitmore's chief of operations for 15 years, the man who handled difficult situations, the one who got his hands dirty while Preston maintained plausible deniability. And now he was a liability eliminated, a loose end tied off, evidence destroyed in the most permanent way possible. The discovery triggered immediate action. Agent Martinez obtained emergency warrants and arrested Preston Whitmore at his estate in St. Helena. The charges were preliminary, conspiracy, and obstruction. But the message was clear. The FBI believed Preston had ordered both Anthony Castellano's murder and Richard Calloway's execution, and they were building a case to prove it. Preston's arraignment became a media circus. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. Preston walked through the gauntlet with his lawyers flanking him, his face a mask of contempt and barely controlled rage. When his eyes found Daniel in the crowd, the look he gave promised retribution, consequences, a reckoning that would come whether the law convicted him or not. The preliminary hearing revealed the prosecution's theory. Anthony Castellano had discovered evidence of the contemporary counterfeiting operation, possibly through his own investigation or through documents his mother had left him. He'd attempted to gather proof, but Richard Calloway had discovered his investigation. Under orders from Preston, Calloway had killed Anthony and disposed of the body. When the FBI investigation intensified, when it became clear that Calloway could be connected to Anthony's murder, Preston had eliminated his chief of operations to remove the link between himself and the killing. It was a compelling narrative supported by circumstantial evidence and the testimony of Robert Chen, who detailed how the Whitmore organization operated, how Preston maintained deniability through layers of subordinates who executed his orders without explicit instructions. But without Calloway alive to testify, without digital evidence of Preston's direct involvement, the case remained circumstantial. Preston made bail $5 million posted by the Whitmore Wine Estate's corporate accounts and returned to his mansion to await trial. His lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence, to dismiss charges, to delay proceedings. The legal battle that lay ahead would take years, cost millions, and the outcome remained uncertain. Through all of this, Daniel kept working. The vines didn't care about legal proceedings or media coverage. They followed their ancient rhythm, growing toward harvest with the patient inevitability of natural processes. By midsummer, the grape clusters had gone through veraison, the magical transformation where hard green fruit began to soften and color, taking on the deep purple of Cabernet Sauvignon or the translucent red of Zinfandel. The vineyard hummed with life, insects and birds, the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze, the promise of vintage. Jean-Paul walked the rows daily, tasting grapes, assessing ripeness, consulting with Maria about harvest timing. They would pick when the grapes told them they were ready, not according to some predetermined schedule. This was Vincent's philosophy, the patience to wait for perfection rather than settling for adequacy. One evening in late August, as the heat of the day gave way to the cool relief of delta breezes flowing in from San Francisco Bay, Harrison Blackwell invited Daniel to dinner at his estate in Yountville. The old man's home was elegant without ostentation, filled with wine memorabilia and photographs that chronicled a lifetime of collecting, studying, and honoring California's viticultural history. Over a meal prepared by Harrison's private chef, the two men talked about everything except the investigation. They discussed harvest strategy, aging protocols, the French oak barrels they'd ordered for the reserve program. They tasted through wines from Harrison's cellar, comparing old-world elegance with new-world power, discussing the philosophy of winemaking as a conversation across centuries. Finally, as Harrison poured a 1982 Bordeaux that had aged into something profound, he spoke about what had been unspoken between them since the beginning. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Daniel, about why this matters so much to me, about what Vincent Castellano meant to me." Daniel waited, sensing that whatever revelation was coming had been held close for decades, that its release now was both necessary and painful. "My real name is Harrison Castellano Blackwell," Harrison said quietly. "My mother was Vincent's younger sister. She married a British diplomat, moved to London, changed her name to fit into his world. But she never forgot her brother, never stopped loving him despite the ocean between them. When Vincent disappeared in 1968, she was devastated. She spent the rest of her life trying to understand what happened, hiring investigators, pursuing leads that went nowhere. When she died, she left me everything, including her obsession with finding the truth." The words landed softly in the room's amber light, rearranging everything Daniel thought he understood about his partner's motivations. This wasn't just about historical preservation or justice for a murdered winemaker. This was personal, familial, a debt of love that transcended death. "I was 18 when Vincent disappeared," Harrison continued. "I'd spent that summer at Castellano Estate, working harvest, learning from my uncle. He was brilliant, passionate, completely devoted to his craft. The last time I saw him, he seemed afraid. He told me that if anything happened, I should find the reserve bottles, that they contained more than wine. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. By the time I was old enough to investigate, the trail was cold, the witnesses dead or silent, the evidence buried. Until the foreclosure gave you the chance to buy the property," Daniel said. "Until you appeared, and I realized I couldn't do this alone. I'm 76 years old, I have money and connections, but I needed someone with the energy, the intelligence, the determination to see this through. When I researched your background, when I learned about your grandfather's connection to Vincent, it felt like fate. Like Vincent had reached across the decades to bring us together." Daniel thought about the chain of coincidences that had led him here. His insomnia-driven internet search, the auction where Harrison had outbid Preston, the hidden room that opened to his grandfather's birth year, the caves beneath Block 7. Each link in the chain seemed random, but together they formed a pattern that felt almost orchestrated. "Do you believe in justice?" Harrison asked. "Real justice, not the compromised version we get from courts and lawyers, but the fundamental righting of wrongs, the balancing of accounts across time." "I believe the truth matters," Daniel said. "I believe Vincent deserved better than to be murdered and forgotten. I believe his wine, his vision, his integrity deserve to be remembered and honored. If that's justice, then yes, I believe in it." Harrison raised his glass. "To Vincent, to truth, and to the wine we're going to make that will prove his genius wasn't buried with him. They drank, and the wine was extraordinary, proof that greatness could survive decades, that patience was rewarded, that some things improve with age rather than diminishing. The conversation turned to practical matters. Harvest was 3 weeks away. They'd ordered new fermentation tanks, French oak barrels from a cooperative in Burgundy, temperature control systems that would give Jean-Paul the precision Vincent had achieved through intuition and experience. The investment was substantial, nearly exhausting Harrison's committed capital, but both men agreed that compromise at this stage would betray everything they'd worked toward. "There's one more thing you should know," Harrison said as the evening wound down. "Preston Whitmore's lawyers have filed a civil suit. They're claiming that our investigation has damaged the Whitmore brand, that our public statements have constituted defamation, that we're liable for the business losses they've suffered since the scandal broke. They're seeking $200 million in damages." Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied financial threat. $200 million was absurd, far more than the estate was worth, more than Harrison's foundation could possibly pay. But the suit wasn't really about money. It was about applying pressure, creating stress, forcing them to settle, to back down, to let the past stay buried. "What do you want to do?" Daniel asked. "Fight," Harrison said without hesitation. "Every accusation in that lawsuit requires them to prove our statements were false, which means they'll have to defend Gerald's innocence, Richard's innocence, Preston's innocence. They'll have to explain Anthony Castellano's murder, Richard Calloway's execution, the evidence we found in the caves. They'll have to put their entire dirty history on trial, and I guarantee you they won't want that level of scrutiny." The lawsuit was a bluff, Harrison believed, an intimidation tactic designed to make them question whether pursuing justice was worth the financial risk. But for Daniel, who'd spent his career analyzing risk and reward, the calculation was straightforward. They'd already invested everything that mattered: their reputations, their time, their resources, their commitment to honoring Vincent's memory. Backing down now would make all of that meaningless. "Then we fight," Daniel agreed. "We make the wine, we tell the truth, and we let the world decide what matters more, protecting powerful men or honoring murdered visionaries." They shook hands, two men separated by almost 20 years but united by purpose, and Daniel drove back to Castellano Estate through a night brilliant with stars. The vineyard slept under the vast darkness, the vines heavy with fruit, waiting for the moment when sun and sugar reached perfect balance, when Jean-Paul would walk the rows and declare them ready, when harvest would begin, and the work of the year would culminate in those frantic days of picking and crushing and fermentation. Daniel stood in Block 7, among the old Zinfandel vines on soil where Richard Calloway had been buried, where Vincent's caves held decades of patient witness to truth, and felt the weight of everything converging toward this harvest. The first vintage under their stewardship. The wine that would either prove they could honor Vincent's vision or demonstrate that some magic couldn't be recreated. Some genius couldn't be replicated even with all the formulas and technology and determination in the world. But he wasn't afraid. So, he'd learned over these months that fear and purpose weren't opposites but companions, that the things worth doing always came with risk, that the alternative to risking failure was the guarantee of never achieving anything that mattered. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The vines rustled with the promise of fruit nearly ready. And somewhere in the darkness, Daniel felt the presence of everyone who'd brought him to this moment. Jennifer, whose death had freed him from comfortable numbness. His grandfather Antonio, whose silent witness had planted questions that took 50 years to sprout. Vincent Castellano, whose refusal to compromise had cost him everything but left seeds that refused to die. Harrison, whose patient decades of searching had finally found its purpose. Michael and Rebecca, who'd chosen to risk their futures on their father's redemption. They were all here in the vineyard, in the soil, in the vines and the grapes swelling toward harvest. And when the wine was made, when it was aged and bottled and finally opened, it would carry all of them forward. A liquid testament to the idea that truth mattered, that integrity had value, that some things were worth dying for and worth living for in equal measure. Daniel walked back to the manor house as the moon rose over the eastern hills, its light silvering the vineyard rows, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened in the courts or the media or the complicated human realm of laws and consequences, they had already won. They'd found the truth. They'd exposed the corruption. They'd given Vincent Castellano's legacy the resurrection it deserved. Everything else was details. The harvest would come, the wine would be made, and the story that had begun with murder in 1968 would find its resolution not in revenge or retribution, but in the simple act of making something beautiful, something true, something worthy of the man who died rather than compromise his vision. That was justice enough. That was redemption. That was the only victory that mattered. And it was waiting for them 3 weeks away in grapes heavy with sugar and promise, ready to be transformed into wine that would speak across generations, that would prove Vincent Castellano's genius hadn't been silenced, only waiting for the right moment to be heard again. September arrived with the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed. The grapes hung heavy on the vines, their skins taut with sugar, their flavors approaching that perfect moment when waiting another day would mean missing the window of optimal ripeness. Jean-Paul walked the vineyard at dawn each morning, tasting fruit from different blocks, different elevations, consulting his refractometer to measure sugar levels, assessing acid balance with the precision of a surgeon and the intuition of an artist who'd spent 40 years learning to read what grapes were trying to say. Daniel stood beside him in Block 7 on a morning when fog hung thick in the valley below, the old Zinfandel vines emerging from the mist like sentinels posted across time. Jean-Paul crushed a grape between his fingers, studied the juice, tasted it with the focused attention of someone decoding a language most people couldn't hear. 3 days, he said finally. Maybe 4. The Cabernet needs just a little more time. The acid is still high, but the Zinfandel is ready now. This is the tension Vincent would have felt every harvest. The different varieties ripen at different rates. You must choose when to pick each block, and the choice matters more than people understand. Too early and you have green flavors, harsh tannins. Too late and you lose acidity. The wine becomes flabby, unstructured. The perfect moment exists for perhaps 48 hours, and then it's gone. Maria Santos had assembled a harvest crew, experienced workers who'd picked grapes in Napa for decades, people who understood that speed mattered, but care mattered more. The winery was ready, the fermentation tanks cleaned and tested, the crushers and destemmers serviced and waiting. Michael had organized the logistics with the efficiency he'd learned in consulting, creating schedules that accounted for weather, for ripeness variations, for the reality that harvest was controlled chaos no matter how carefully you planned. Rebecca had prepared the estate for visitors. Word had spread through the wine community that Castellano Estate's first harvest in decades would be a historic moment. Wine writers had requested access. Collectors wanted to tour the facility. The story of Vincent's murder and the investigation into the Whitmore conspiracy had created a level of public interest that made privacy impossible. Rebecca had turned necessity into opportunity, organizing a harvest celebration that would introduce the estate to the broader community while generating goodwill and potential customers for wines that wouldn't be ready to sell for at least 2 years. But the shadow of Preston Whitmore's threat hung over everything. His trial wasn't scheduled until spring, but his lawyers had been aggressive in pretrial motions, seeking to suppress evidence, to prevent testimony about Gerald's historical crimes, to narrow the case to just the recent murders where proof of Preston's direct involvement remained circumstantial. The civil lawsuit moved forward in parallel, demanding damages, depositions, discovery that forced Daniel and Harrison to spend hours with attorneys when they should have been focused on harvest. And then there was the vandalism. It started small. Irrigation lines cut in the night, requiring emergency repairs to prevent the vines from suffering water stress in the final crucial days before harvest. Equipment sabotaged, a tractor's fuel contaminated with sugar, rendering it useless. The incidents were spaced out, deniable, just common enough to create an atmosphere of paranoia without providing clear evidence of coordinated harassment. Sheriff Henderson increased patrols, but 80 acres couldn't be monitored constantly, and whoever was conducting the sabotage knew the property well, knew where the blind spots were, knew how to move through the vineyard without triggering motion sensors or alerting the security system Daniel had installed. "This is meant to rattle us," Harrison said during an emergency meeting in the Manor House library. "Preston wants us distracted, anxious, making mistakes. He wants us to question whether the harvest is worth the risk. whether we should just sell the property and walk away while we still can. "We're not walking away," Daniel said, and the certainty in his voice surprised him. 6 months ago, he'd been a lost widower playing at a fantasy of making wine. Now he'd become someone who understood what mattered, what was worth defending, what hills were worth dying on. This harvest represented more than just business. It was Vincent's vindication, his grandfather's redemption. The proof that truth could survive 56 years of burial and still emerge into light. The decision to proceed came with security measures. Daniel hired a private security firm to patrol the property during the critical harvest window. Staff were instructed to work in pairs, to report anything unusual immediately, to treat the next week as if they were operating in hostile territory. The precautions felt excessive until they weren't. On the night before harvest was scheduled to begin, Daniel couldn't sleep. The weight of everything converging felt physical, a pressure in his chest that made breathing difficult. He walked the vineyard under a moon 2 days past full, the rows of vines casting shadows that stretched and merged in the silver light. In Block 3, where the oldest Cabernet grew, he stood among vines that had produced the legendary 1965 vintage, their gnarled trunks testimony to survival and stubborn vitality. He thought about Vincent walking these same rows 56 years earlier, knowing his time was running out, knowing Gerald Whitmore's threats were real, knowing that the choice between silence and truth might cost him everything. What gave a man the courage to choose truth when silence would save his life? What made integrity worth dying for? Daniel didn't have answers, but standing among the vines that had outlasted Vincent, outlasted Gerald, outlasted decades of neglect and abandonment, he felt something shift inside him. Fear was still there, but it had become background noise, drowned out by purpose sharpened to clarity. They would make the wine. They would honor Vincent's vision. And whatever Preston Whitmore did in response would be his own moral failing, not theirs. The sound of an engine broke the night's silence. Daniel turned toward the access road that ran along the eastern boundary of the property, expecting to see the security patrol making their rounds. Instead, he saw headlights moving slowly, deliberately toward Block 7. No security vehicle, no identification lights, just a pickup truck that killed its lights as it turned onto the service road that led into the heart of the vineyard. Daniel's phone was in his pocket. He could call Sheriff Henderson, call the security team, wait for help to arrive. But instinct older than civilization told him that some confrontations couldn't be delegated, that some moments required personal courage, even when caution would be wiser. He moved through the rows toward Block 7, keeping low, using the vines for cover, his heart hammering, but his mind focused with the clarity that comes when choices narrow to essential binary. Stop them or let them succeed. Stand or run. Fight or surrender. The truck had stopped near the section where Richard Calloway's body had been found and removed. 2 men climbed out, neither of whom Daniel recognized. They were younger, maybe 30s, with the hard fitness of men who spent time in gyms preparing for violence. One carried a large container, and when he opened it, the smell of gasoline cut through the night air like a threat made manifest. They were going to burn the vineyard, not the whole property. That would be too obvious, too clearly arson. But Block 7, where Vincent had hidden his evidence, where the old Zinfandel grew, where Jean-Paul had declared the fruit perfect and ready for harvest at dawn. Burn it now, destroy this year's vintage before it could be made. Send a message that couldn't be misunderstood. Daniel pulled out his phone, started recording video, the camera lens capturing the 2 men, the gasoline container, the deliberate approach to the vines. He stepped out from cover, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Both men froze, hands moving instinctively toward weapons concealed at their waists. The taller one recovered first, his expression cycling through surprise to calculation. "You're trespassing," he said, though his tone carried no conviction. "Private property." "This is my property," Daniel replied, holding up his phone so they could see the recording light. "And you're about to commit arson. The video I'm recording will make that very clear to the police." The 2 men exchanged glances, uncertain. They'd been hired for a simple job, probably told the property would be empty, that they could do their work and leave without complications. The presence of a witness with a camera changed everything. Then a third vehicle appeared, a black Mercedes pulling up behind the pickup truck. Daniel's stomach dropped as Preston Whitmore emerged, dressed in expensive casual wear, his presence transforming the situation from simple vandalism to something far more dangerous. "Mr. Brennan," Preston said, his voice carrying that cultivated reasonableness that made threats sound like friendly advice. "This is unfortunate. I was just driving by, saw these men on what I thought was abandoned property. I was about to call the sheriff myself." Daniel kept his phone steady, making sure the camera captured Preston's face, his proximity to the men with the gasoline, the context that made his claimed innocence absurd. "Save it for your lawyers, Preston. I've got you on video. You, your hired men, the gasoline, attempted arson while out on bail for murder. I'd say that's going to play badly with the judge." Preston's manufactured concern evaporated, replaced by cold fury. "You don't know when to quit, do you? My family built an empire over 3 generations. We employed hundreds of people. We contributed to this community, and you're destroying it all because of some romantic obsession with a dead man's paranoid delusions." "Vincent Castellano wasn't delusional," Daniel said quietly. "He was murdered because he refused to participate in your grandfather's fraud. Anthony Castellano was murdered because he got too close to proving it. Richard Calloway was murdered because he could testify against you. 3 generations of Whitmores, 3 generations of killing anyone who threatened your empire built on lies. You can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can. The FBI has Gerald's original ledgers. They have Robert Chen's testimony. They have forensic evidence. And now I have video of you attempting to destroy my vineyard. Sheriff Henderson is already on his way. I called him before I stepped out of the vines." It was a calculated bluff. Daniel hadn't called anyone. His phone had been set to record video, not transmit. But Preston's legal instincts were working through the scenarios, calculating risks. And he was smart enough to know that being caught red-handed attempting arson would eliminate any chance of a favorable plea bargain. He turned to the 2 hired men, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Get in the truck. We're leaving." The men hesitated, looking at the gasoline container they'd left on the ground, evidence of their intent. Preston jerked his head toward the truck with more urgency. "Now leave everything." As the 3 of them climbed into their vehicles, Preston paused at the Mercedes door. His face, illuminated by the dome light, showed not fear but calculation, the look of a man already planning his next move. "This isn't over, Brennan. You think you've won something here tonight, but all you've done is make this personal. I was willing to let the courts handle this. Now I'm going to make sure you regret every choice you've made." "I already called Sheriff Henderson." Daniel lied again, his voice steady. "He'll be here in about 2 minutes. You might want to be gone before then." The Mercedes engine roared to life, and both vehicles disappeared down the access road, taillights fading into darkness. Daniel stood alone among the vines, his hands shaking now that the confrontation was over, and actually called Sheriff Henderson to report the incident. The video evidence would be useful, the gasoline container would have fingerprints, and Preston's bail would likely be revoked based on this attempted crime. But more than the legal implications, something fundamental had shifted in Daniel. He'd faced down men sent to destroy what he'd built, confronted a man who'd ordered murders, and he hadn't flinched. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. Purpose had become stronger than self-preservation, and that transformation, Daniel recognized, was irreversible. Sheriff Henderson arrived with 3 deputies and Agent Martinez, who'd been working late when the call came through. They collected the gasoline container, documented the tire tracks, took Daniel's statement, and copied the video evidence. Martinez's face was grim but satisfied. "This is enough to revoke bail," she said. "Preston Whitmore will be back in custody by morning. And this establishes a pattern of obstruction, of attempting to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. The DA can add charges. Between this and the murder case, Preston's looking at serious time even if we can't prove he personally killed anyone." "How strong is the murder case?" Daniel asked. Martinez hesitated, her honesty warring with her desire to provide reassurance. "Circumstantial. We can prove Anthony Castellano was murdered. We can place Preston's vehicle near the scene. We can establish motive. But we don't have physical evidence directly connecting Preston to the killing. Richard Calloway could have been acting independently, and with him dead, we can't compel his testimony. A good defense attorney will create reasonable doubt. So he might walk on the murder charges. He might take a plea, serve significant time for the fraud and obstruction charges. The justice system isn't designed for moral satisfaction. It's designed for what we can prove beyond reasonable doubt. Daniel understood. Sometimes the guilty escaped full accountability because the law required proof that reality couldn't provide. But the truth was out. Vincent's story was known. The Whitmore Empire was destroyed. That would have to be enough. Harvest began at dawn with the Zinfandel in Block 7. The crew moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, cutting clusters and placing them gently in bins, their hands stained purple by juice, their backs bent to work that had been done the same way for centuries. Jean-Paul supervised with the intensity of a conductor leading an orchestra through a symphony that had to be perfect because there would be no second performance. Daniel worked alongside the crew, learning the rhythm of the work, the careful selection of which clusters to pick and which to leave for a second pass. The grapes were beautiful, each cluster a work of art, the individual berries swollen with sugar and flavor, their skins thick enough to provide tannin structure, but not so thick as to make the wine harsh. This was what Vincent had achieved in 1965, this perfection of fruit that came from old vines, careful management, and the patience to wait for the exact right moment. By noon, they'd harvested 3 tons of Zinfandel, the bins loaded onto trucks for the short drive to the winery. The crushing began immediately, Jean-Paul monitoring every stage, adjusting the destemmer to remove stems while keeping the berries whole, controlling the crush to extract juice without over-macerating the skins. The smell of fermenting grapes filled the winery, sweet and alive, the smell of potential becoming real. Rebecca documented everything with her camera, creating a visual archive of this first harvest, the people and processes that would become part of the estate's story. Michael managed logistics, coordinating the flow of fruit from vineyard to winery, ensuring that nothing sat too long waiting to be processed, that the cold chain was maintained to preserve the grape's delicate chemistry. Harrison watched from the winery office, his weathered face reflecting emotions too complex to name. This was his uncle's dream made real, 56 years after Vincent's death, by people who'd never met him, but who honored his vision through the simple act of making wine the way he would have made it, with integrity and care and uncompromising standards. The Cabernet harvest began 2 days later, and it required even more precision. The clusters were smaller, the berries more compact, the sorting more critical, because any underripe or damaged fruit would compromise the final blend. Jean-Paul rejected anything that didn't meet his standards, and the rejected fruit piled up like casualties of a war for quality. Daniel watched thousands of dollars worth of grapes go to waste because they weren't perfect, and understood that this was the difference between good wine and great wine, between commercial success and artistic integrity. Vincent would throw away half the crop some years, Jean-Paul explained, as they sorted through another bin. People thought he was crazy, but he understood that excellence requires sacrifice. You cannot make great wine from mediocre grapes. You can make acceptable wine, profitable wine, wine that satisfies people who don't know better. But transcendent wine, wine that speaks across decades, that requires accepting loss in service of quality. The lesson went beyond winemaking. Daniel had spent his career in corporate finance, where acceptable returns were celebrated, where mediocrity that met quarterly targets was rewarded, where the excellent was often sacrificed to the demands of the good enough. Standing in the winery, sorting grapes with bleeding fingers and an aching back, he understood for the first time what Jennifer had meant when she'd urged him to find work that mattered. This mattered. The fruit they rejected mattered as much as the fruit they kept, because the rejection was the standard, the line between compromise and integrity. By the end of the week, they'd harvested 8 tons of Cabernet, 2 tons of Merlot, half a ton of Petit Verdot. The fermentation tanks bubbled with primary fermentation, wild yeast converting sugar to alcohol, the chemistry of transformation happening in stainless steel vessels that Vincent would have recognized. Jean-Paul monitored temperatures, punch downs, the extraction of color and tannin from skins, making adjustments with the precision of a chemist and the instinct of an artist. The 1965 Vincent made was 60% Cabernet, 25% Merlot, 10% Petit Verdot, 5% Zinfandel, Jean-Paul said, consulting Vincent's original notes. We have the varieties in the right proportions. We have old vines, we have the terroir, we have the techniques. The question is whether we have the courage to follow Vincent's vision exactly, or whether we'll hedge, compromise, try to make something that appeals to modern tastes rather than honoring his original intent. We honor Vincent, Daniel said without hesitation. We make his wine his way, and we let the world decide if it was worth waiting 56 years to taste it again. The press conference was Harrison's idea. With Preston back in custody, his bail revoked, his trial date set for spring, it was time to tell the complete story, to explain what they'd found and why it mattered, to put the Castellano estate restoration into context for a public that had followed the scandal in fragments and headlines, but didn't understand the whole narrative. They held it at the estate in the renovated tasting room that had once been Vincent's office, with the vineyard visible through tall windows, the vines now stripped of fruit but still beautiful in their autumn gold. Daniel stood at a podium with Harrison beside him, Michael and Rebecca in the front row, Maria and Jean Paul standing against the back wall, and faced cameras from every major wine publication, several San Francisco TV stations, and a handful of national outlets that had picked up the story. Daniel told them about discovering the hidden room, about Vincent's journals documenting fraud and murder, about the caves beneath Block 7 where evidence had waited for someone brave enough to find it. He explained how his grandfather had worked alongside Vincent, had known the truth, had chosen silence to protect his family. He described Anthony Castellano's murder, Richard Calloway's execution, the 3 generations of Whitmore corruption that had finally been exposed. But mostly, he talked about the wine, about Vincent's genius as a winemaker, his scientific approach to blending, his refusal to compromise quality for profit, about the archived bottles they'd found, wines that had aged for over 50 years and still showed the transcendent quality that had made the original Castellano Reserve legendary, about their commitment to recreating that wine, to proving that Vincent's vision hadn't died with him, that integrity could survive assassination, that truth could be turned into something beautiful and lasting. "We're not making wine to get rich," Daniel said, the words coming from someplace deep and honest. "We're making wine to honor a man who died for refusing to lie. We're making wine to prove that quality matters more than quarterly profits, that patience is rewarded, that some things are worth waiting for. When the Castellano Reserve is ready, probably 2 years from now, it will be Vincent's wine, made his way from his vines using his techniques. And everyone who tastes it will know that his murder didn't silence him. It just delayed him. The truth always finds its voice eventually. Sometimes it takes 56 years. Sometimes it takes the form of wine. But it endures." The questions came fast, skeptical, probing. Would they profit from the tragedy? How could they justify the expense of the investigation? Did they feel responsible for Preston Whitmore's arrest? Daniel answered each question with the honesty that had become his default mode, acknowledging complexity, refusing to oversimplify, treating the journalists like intelligent adults capable of understanding nuance. Rebecca screened a short documentary she'd produced, combining historical footage, interviews with people who'd known Vincent, and contemporary shots of the restoration and harvest. The film ended with Jean Paul tasting from a barrel of the new vintage, his face showing the kind of satisfaction that couldn't be faked, saying simply, "Vincent would be proud." The press conference generated exactly the coverage Harrison had hoped for. Every major wine publication ran features on Castellano Estate's resurrection. The New York Times did a long profile of Daniel, framing his story as a redemption narrative, a widower finding purpose in honoring a murdered winemaker's legacy. Wine Spectator committed to reviewing the first vintage when it was released, acknowledging that the story alone made it one of the most anticipated wines in California history. But more than publicity, the coverage generated something unexpected. Orders. Collectors who wanted to be part of the story, who wanted to own a bottle of the wine that had taken 56 years to make, who were willing to put down deposits 2 years in advance for the privilege of eventually purchasing something that might or might not be great, but would certainly be historically significant. Michael compiled the numbers with the excitement of someone who discovered that idealism could coexist with profitability. They had advance orders for 400 cases at $300 per bottle, revenue of more than $1 million, enough to fund operations for years, enough to prove that the estate could be financially sustainable without compromising Vincent's standards. We're going to make it, Michael said, showing Daniel the spreadsheets in the Manor House study. Not just survive, but actually thrive. We can expand the reserve program. We can invest in the second label wines. We can create the educational center Rebecca's been planning. Dad, you did it. You actually pulled this off. Daniel looked at his son, seeing in Michael's face a pride that went beyond financial success, and felt something unlock in his chest, some final piece of grief or doubt or fear releasing its hold. They'd made wine together, father and son, honoring a great-grandfather Michael had never known, resurrecting a legacy that connected them to soil and sun in the patient work of coaxing beauty from earth. We did it, Daniel corrected. This wasn't me alone. This was all of us, and Vincent, and Harrison, and everyone who refused to let the truth stay buried. We're just the ones who happened to be here when it was time for the resurrection. That night, as autumn rain began to fall, washing the vineyard clean after the intensity of harvest, Daniel sat in Vincent's old study, now his study, and wrote a letter to Jennifer. He'd stopped visiting her grave months ago, had stopped the one-sided conversations with the dead that had defined the first years of his grief. But tonight he needed to tell her what he'd learned, what their marriage had taught him that he'd only now begun to understand. He wrote about purpose and passion, about the difference between success and significance, about how her death had forced him to confront questions he'd spent his career avoiding. He wrote about fear and courage, about standing in a vineyard facing down men sent to destroy what he'd built, about discovering that he had more spine than he'd given himself credit for. He wrote about their children, about Michael's transformation from skeptical consultant to passionate vintner, about Rebecca's gift for storytelling and her commitment to honoring the past while building the future. And he wrote about wine, about how something as simple as grapes and time and careful attention could become a vessel for truth, a way of speaking across generations, a form of resurrection for the dead and the living alike. He didn't mail the letter. There was no address for the dead, no way to bridge that final distance. But writing it brought a kind of peace, a recognition that grief and purpose could coexist, that honoring the dead meant living fully rather than just surviving. The rain fell harder, drumming against the manor house roof, and Daniel stood at the window looking out over the vineyard he'd bought on impulse, restored through determination, and defended through courage he hadn't known he possessed. Somewhere in the winery, in French oak barrels, the wine was aging, tannin softening, flavors integrating, Vincent's vision becoming tangible reality one day at a time. The truth had found its voice. Justice was imperfect, but real. And the wine, when it was ready, would speak for everyone who'd fought to make it possible. Everyone who'd refused to let murder and corruption have the final word. Everyone who believed that some things mattered more than safety, more than profit, more than the comfortable numbness of a life lived without risk. Daniel raised his glass to the rain, to the vines, to Vincent and Antonio and Anthony, and even Richard Calloway, to all the dead who'd brought him here, and drank to the truth that had survived 56 years of burial and would survive centuries more in bottles of wine that proved genius couldn't be silenced, only delayed. The storm passed, the vines rested, and in the barrel room, the wine aged toward its destiny, patient as stone, inevitable as truth. Spring arrived at Castellano Estate with the gentle insistence of seasons that recognized no human calendar, only the ancient rhythm of earth tilting toward sun. 2 years had passed since that first harvest, 2 years of patient waiting while the wine aged in French oak barrels, while lawyers argued motions and countermotions, while the world that had briefly focused its attention on murder and resurrection moved on to newer scandals, fresher outrages. But here, in the barrel room where light filtered through high windows to paint the concrete floor in shifting patterns, time moved at the pace Vincent Castellano would have recognized. The slow alchemy of tannins softening, flavors integrating, potential becoming reality. Daniel stood before barrel number 7, the one Jean-Paul had marked with a small brass plaque reading Vincent's Vision, 2024 vintage, and drew a sample with the practiced motion he'd learned over countless tastings. The wine was garnet moving toward brick at the edges, the color of time made visible. He swirled it gently, noting how it clung to the glass, the legs descending slowly, speaking of concentration and structure. The aroma hit him first, as it always did, That complex integration of dark fruit and earth, tobacco and leather, with something underneath that was pure Napa terroir, the mineral backbone that came from old vines drinking deep from limestone soil. He tasted, holding the wine on his palate, letting it warm and open, reveal its secrets the way Vincent's journals had revealed theirs. The tannins were still firm, but no longer aggressive, providing structure without harshness. The acidity balanced the fruit perfectly, that tension between ripeness and freshness that marked great wine. The finish lasted minutes, evolving as he swallowed, new flavors emerging in waves. Blackberry gave way to cassis, then earth, then something almost floral, then back to fruit, but deeper now, more complex. Jean-Paul appeared at his shoulder, silent as always when approaching someone in conversation with wine. He took his own sample, tasted with the focused attention of 4 decades making wine on 3 continents, and after a long moment, nodded slowly. "It is ready," he said simply. "Better than ready. This wine has become what Vincent dreamed it could be. We have honored him. More than that, we have proven he was right. Excellence is patient. Truth is worth waiting for. And genius, when properly respected, can speak across generations." The decision to bottle the 2024 Castellano Reserve triggered a cascade of preparations that had been planned for months but still felt sudden, overwhelming, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the only way forward was to jump. Michael coordinated the bottling logistics, arranging for mobile bottling equipment, ordering custom bottles and labels that Rebecca had designed, labels that featured a subtle sketch of the manor house, and the words Castellano Reserve, Vincent's Formula, Resurrected 2024. Maria managed the pre-release orders, responding to collectors who'd been waiting 2 years for allocation, managing the wait list that had grown to 3,000 names despite the wine's $300 per bottle price point. The economics were almost absurd. They would bottle 1,200 cases, just over 14,000 bottles, and everyone was already sold before the cork went in. Revenue of $4.2 million from a single vintage, enough to fund operations for years, enough to expand production, invest in the second label program, build the education center Rebecca had designed. But the money, while necessary, felt almost beside the point. They'd proven something more valuable than commercial success. They'd proven that integrity could survive in a world that rewarded compromise, that quality could triumph over efficiency, that Vincent's vision hadn't been romantic delusion, but achievable reality for anyone willing to make the sacrifices excellence demanded. The trial had ended 3 months earlier, and the verdict had been a study in the imperfect nature of justice. Preston Whitmore was convicted of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit arson, and multiple counts of fraud related to the wine counterfeiting operation. The murder charges, lacking direct physical evidence, resulted in a hung jury. The prosecution chose not to retry, accepting the 30-year sentence Preston received on the other counts as sufficient punishment for a man in his 60s who would likely die in prison regardless of whether the murder conviction was secured. The civil lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice, the judge ruling that truth was an absolute defense against defamation, that everything Daniel and Harrison had said about the Whitmore family was supported by evidence and therefore protected speech. Whitmore Wine Estates had declared bankruptcy, its assets liquidated, its brand permanently tainted by association with 3 generations of fraud. But what struck Daniel most about the trial's conclusion was how little satisfaction he felt. Preston Whitmore behind bars didn't resurrect Vincent Castellano or Anthony Castellano or Richard Calloway. Justice, such as it was, felt more like accounting than redemption, a balancing of ledgers that changed the past not at all and the future only marginally. The real victory was in the barrel room, in the bottles waiting to be filled, in the wine that would speak Vincent's truth more eloquently than any courtroom testimony. Harrison had aged visibly over the 2 years, the weight of 80 approaching 81 settling into his bones, slowing his movements, sharpening the edges of his face until he looked like a sketch of himself, the essential form emerging as the excess fell away. But his mind remained sharp, his passion for the project undimmed, and on the day they began bottling the reserve, he stood in the winery watching the process with an intensity that suggested he was afraid to blink, afraid that if he looked away for even a moment, the dream might dissolve like morning fog under harsh sun. Daniel joined him as the first bottles moved down the line, each one filled, corked, labeled, and packed with mechanical precision that somehow didn't diminish the reverence the moment deserved. Vincent should be here, Harrison said quietly. He should see what we've made. He should know his murder didn't destroy his legacy, just delayed it. Maybe he does know, Daniel replied. Maybe that's what legacy means. The part of us that survives death, that continues to shape the world long after we're gone. Vincent is in this wine. Every decision we made honored his vision. Every compromise we refused was his integrity speaking through us. He's here, Harrison. He's been here the whole time. The old man's eyes glistened, and he turned away to compose himself. But not before Daniel saw the tears that 60 years of grief had finally earned the right to shed. They stood together in silence, watching bottles fill with wine that had cost so much, meant so much, proved so much. Rebecca had organized the grand opening for the first Saturday in May, when the vineyard was at its most beautiful. The vines leafing out in brilliant green, the air perfumed with the wild mustard that grew between the rows. She'd sent invitations to wine critics, collectors, journalists, anyone who'd followed the story from Vincent's murder through the investigation, trial, and resurrection. The response had been overwhelming. 300 confirmed guests, the maximum the estate could comfortably accommodate, with another 200 on the wait list. The day dawned clear and warm, one of those perfect Napa Valley mornings that reminded people why they'd fallen in love with wine country in the first place. The manor house gleamed with fresh paint, its Victorian elegance restored to something approaching its original grandeur. The gardens Rebecca and Maria had planted bloomed in careful profusion, roses and lavender, and herbs that would eventually supply the estate kitchen. The tasting room, built in what had been Vincent's original office, featured a long bar of reclaimed wood from the old fermentation tanks, behind which stood floor-to-ceiling racks displaying the estate's wines. And in the place of honor, behind glass in a climate-controlled case, sat 6 bottles from the cave archive, wines Vincent had made between 1960 and 1968, the physical evidence of genius that had survived 56 years, waiting to be acknowledged. Michael had designed the event flow with his consultant's eye for logistics. Guests would arrive, tour the restored manor house, and see the exhibits Rebecca had created documenting Vincent's life and the investigation that had vindicated him. Then they'd walk the vineyard, see Block 7 where the old Zinfandel grew, see the entrance to the caves where evidence had been hidden. Finally, they'd return to the winery for the moment everyone had been waiting for, the official release tasting of the 2024 Castellano Reserve. Daniel stood in the library of the manor house, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his wedding day nearly 40 years earlier. Jennifer would have laughed at him, would have told him to breathe, would have reminded him that he'd already done the hard part and today was just celebration. He could almost hear her voice, feel her presence. And the grief that had defined his first years as a widower had transformed into something gentler. A melancholy that coexisted with purpose. A missing that didn't diminish the fullness of his current life. "You look good, Dad," Rebecca said, appearing in the doorway with her camera slung around her neck. Distinguished, like someone who built something that matters. "I didn't build this alone," Daniel said. "This was all of us. You and Michael, Harrison, Jean Paul, Maria, everyone who believed in what we were trying to do. But you were the one who took the risk," Rebecca countered. "You were the one who walked away from safety to chase a dream. You were the one who stood up to Preston Whitmore when it would have been easier to back down. Give yourself some credit. Mom would be proud of you. Grandpa Antonio would be proud. Hell, Vincent would be proud. And you never even met him." The first guests arrived at noon, and for the next 3 hours, Daniel moved through a blur of conversations, handshakes, questions about the wine and the investigation and what came next. Wine critics he'd only known from bylines asked about Vincent's techniques, about how closely they'd followed his formulas, about whether they believed the wine could truly match the legendary 1965 vintage. Collectors wanted to know about future releases, about allocation, about whether the estate would expand production. Journalists asked about the trial, about Preston's conviction, about how it felt to have solved a 56-year-old murder. Daniel answered each question with the honesty that had become his default, acknowledging complexity, refusing to oversimplify, treating everyone as intelligent enough to understand that truth was rarely simple and justice was never complete. He talked about Vincent's genius, his grandfather's silence, the long shadow that murder cast across generations. He talked about the wine as a form of resurrection, about how excellence endured even when the men who created it did not. But what he didn't talk about, what he kept private even from the journalist who pressed hardest, was the personal transformation he'd undergone over these 2 years. How a lost widower had become a confident vintner. How fear had been replaced not with fearlessness, but with purpose strong enough to make fear irrelevant. How grief had transformed from an open wound into a scar that aches sometimes but didn't disable. How he discovered that meaning wasn't something you found, but something you built day by day, decision by decision, choosing integrity over convenience, often enough that it became habitual. The vineyard tour took an hour, Jean-Paul leading groups through the rows, explaining Vincent's approach to viticulture, pointing out the old vines that had produced both the legendary 1965 vintage and the new 2024 release. He spoke about terroir, that untranslatable French concept that captured how specific places produce specific flavors, how these 80 acres of Napa hillside contain something unique that couldn't be replicated anywhere else on Earth. In Block 7, where the old Zinfandel vines twisted from soil that had absorbed Richard Callaway's blood before the body was removed, Jean-Paul spoke about how vines were amoral, how they took nutrients from whatever was available and transformed it into grapes without judgment or preference. The observation was meant to be scientific, but Daniel heard the metaphor. The vineyard had survived murder, fraud, decades of neglect, and still it produced fruit of exceptional quality. Resilience wasn't about avoiding damage, but about transforming it into something that served life rather than death. The cave tour, led by Maria, drew the most emotional responses. Standing in the limestone chamber where Vincent had stored his archive, where evidence had waited half a century to speak, guests seemed to feel the weight of what had happened here, the intersection of human evil and human courage, the long patience of truth waiting for someone brave enough to resurrect it. But it was the wine tasting, held in the winery as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, that transformed the day from interesting to transcendent. Jean-Paul had designed the tasting as a progression, starting with the estate's second label wines, moving through older vintages they'd acquired from collectors, and building toward the moment everyone had come for, the first public tasting of the 2024 Castellano Reserve. The room fell silent as servers poured the wine, the deep garnet liquid catching light, throwing reflections onto the white tablecloths like scattered rubies. 300 glasses, 300 people leaning forward to catch the aroma, 300 moments of first impression that would determine whether 2 years of work, millions of dollars in investment, and the resurrection of a murdered man's legacy had been worth the cost. Daniel tasted along with everyone else, though he'd tasted this wine 100 times during its evolution. But this moment was different. This tasting in public, this submission to judgment by people who knew excellence when they encountered it, who tasted the greatest wines the world produced and wouldn't be impressed by anything less than genuine mastery. The silence stretched, seconds becoming minutes as people tasted, considered, tasted again. Daniel felt his heart hammering, aware that everything they'd built could be undone if the wine wasn't extraordinary, if it was merely very good instead of transcendent, if Vincent's vision proved impossible to recreate despite their best efforts. Then Antonio Galloni, one of the world's most respected wine critics, set down his glass and spoke into the silence. I've tasted the original 1965 Castellano Reserve. I was fortunate enough to have a bottle from a private collection, and I reviewed it for my newsletter 5 years ago. I gave it 100 points, the only perfect score I've awarded in 30 years of professional tasting. I didn't think it was possible to recreate that wine. The conditions were too specific, the winemaker too singular, the moment in history too unique. I was wrong. He paused and the room seemed to hold its breath. This wine is not a copy of the 65. It's a conversation with it. It honors Vincent's vision while acknowledging the half-century that separates the vintages. The structure is similar, the balance is similar, the integration of varieties is nearly identical. But this wine has its own voice, its own story. It speaks of resurrection and redemption, of patience and integrity, of the truth that survives assassination. If the 65 was Vincent's masterpiece, this is his vindication. 100 points. Unquestionably one of the greatest wines California has ever produced. The room erupted, not in applause but in animated conversation, critics and collectors exclaiming over the wine, comparing notes, tasting again to verify what their first impression had told them. Daniel stood rooted, unable to fully process what had just happened, aware that they'd achieved something rare, something that would define the estate for generations, something that justified every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. Harrison appeared at his elbow, his weathered face transformed by a smile that erased years. "We did it, Daniel. We honored Vincent. We proved his murder didn't destroy his legacy, and we made wine that will be discussed and studied and treasured for decades to come. Thank you for believing in this dream when it seemed impossible." "Thank you for giving me the chance to chase it," Daniel replied, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Thank you for seeing something in me I didn't see in myself." The evening concluded with a dinner under the stars, long tables set up in the vineyard, strung with lights that turned the gathering into something magical, outside of time. Jean-Paul had prepared a meal that showcased the estate's potential for more than just wine. Local ingredients, simply prepared, each course designed to complement the wines they'd produced. Conversation flowed as easily as the wine. Stories shared, connections made, the community that forms around excellence and shared purpose. Daniel sat between Michael and Rebecca, his children who'd risked their own security to help their father chase an impossible dream, and felt a completeness he'd thought died with Jennifer. She would have loved this, would have understood that this was what she'd been pushing him toward all those years. This discovery that meaning came from building something that mattered, that served purposes beyond personal gain. As the dinner wound down and guests began to depart, expressing gratitude and making plans to visit again, Daniel walked alone to Block 7 one last time. The moon was 3 days past full, bright enough to cast shadows, and the vineyard in that light looked eternal, connected to every vineyard that had ever existed, part of a tradition that stretched back to Mesopotamia, to the first human who'd pressed grapes and discovered that patience transformed juice into something transcendent. He stood where Richard Calloway had been buried, where Preston Whitmore's men had tried to burn the vines, where the old Zinfandel that had been Vincent's secret ingredient still grew, patient and productive after 80 years. The soil here had absorbed violence and transformation in equal measure, had witnessed murder and resurrection, had proven that life was stronger than death, that truth was more durable than lies. Daniel heard footsteps behind him and turned to find a woman in her 70s approaching slowly, using a cane but moving with the determination of someone who'd traveled a long distance and wouldn't be deterred by mere physical limitation. She stopped a few feet away, studying him with eyes that held recognition and something deeper, something like gratitude mixed with grief. "You're Daniel Brennan," she said, not a question but a confirmation. "I'm Sarah's daughter, Vincent Castellano's granddaughter. My mother died before any of this came to light, but I wanted to thank you for what you've done, for finding the truth, for honoring my great-grandfather's memory, for making sure his murder didn't have the final word." Daniel felt the weight of connection across generations, the recognition that what they'd built here mattered to people he'd never met, to family lines that stretched back through Vincent to the old country, to choices made and sacrifices accepted that had shaped the present in ways both seen and invisible. "Your great-grandfather was a remarkable man," Daniel said. "He died for refusing to compromise. That kind of integrity is rare. We just did what anyone should do when they stumble across truth. We brought it into the light." "It's more than that," she said softly. "You gave my family our history back. My mother spent her whole life not talking about her father, carrying the weight of his disappearance as shame rather than tragedy. She thought he'd abandoned her, run away from debts and responsibility. Learning the truth, even though she didn't live to see it publicly acknowledged, changed everything for her. She died knowing her father was a hero, not a coward. That's a gift beyond price." They stood together in silence, two strangers connected by a dead man's courage and a living man's determination to honor it, and Daniel understood that this was the real legacy of what they'd built. Not the wine, though the wine mattered. Not the financial success, though that enabled everything else. The legacy was in moments like this, when truth changed how people understood their past, their family, themselves. The woman left after a few minutes, walking back toward the manor house where her driver waited, but her presence lingered like a benediction, confirmation that the work mattered in ways Daniel was only beginning to understand. The next morning dawned soft and gray, marine layer burning off slowly to reveal another perfect Napa day. Daniel sat on the manor house porch with coffee in the San Francisco Chronicle, whose front page featured a photograph of the previous day's grand opening and a headline that read, "Resurrected Wine Achieves Perfection, Vindicates Murdered Vintner's Vision." The article was comprehensive, detailing Vincent's murder, the investigation, the trial, and the wine that had emerged from 2 years of patient aging. But what struck Daniel was the final paragraph, a quote from Antonio Galloni that seemed to capture everything they tried to achieve. The 2024 Castellano Reserve proves that excellence is timeless. Vincent Castellano's murder in 1968 was meant to silence truth and destroy a vision that threatened powerful men's profits. Instead, it planted seeds that took 56 years to germinate, but have now produced fruit of extraordinary quality. This wine is more than a beverage. It's a testament to the idea that integrity matters, that patience is rewarded, that some things are worth dying for and worth living for. Every bottle is a small victory over the forces that tried to bury Vincent's legacy, and every person who tastes it participates in his resurrection. That's not just great wine, that's transcendence. Michael and Rebecca joined him on the porch, Michael with his laptop reviewing the previous day's sales figures, Rebecca with her camera reviewing photos she'd captured. They sat in companionable silence, three people who'd become a team, who'd risked everything on a vision that seemed impossible and had proven that impossible was just another word for difficult. "The advance orders for the next vintage are already coming in," Michael said, looking up from his screen. "We've got commitments for 800 cases before we've even harvested the grapes. If we can maintain this quality, if we can honor Vincent's vision year after year, we're looking at building something sustainable, something that will outlast all of us." "That's the point," Rebecca said. "We're not building a business. We're building a legacy. Every vintage will be a conversation with Vincent, a way of proving that his vision wasn't romantic delusion, but achievable reality. We're custodians, not owners. Our job is to protect his legacy and pass it on to whoever comes next." Daniel looked at his children, at the adults they'd become through this process, and felt a pride that went beyond parental affection. They'd learned what Jennifer had tried to teach him, what his grandfather had understood but couldn't articulate, what Vincent had died defending. That meaning came from serving purposes larger than self-interest, that integrity was its own reward, that the best legacy was the one that empowered others to build on what you'd created. Harrison appeared in the driveway in his vintage Mercedes, arriving for the post-mortem meeting they'd scheduled to debrief the grand opening and plan the next vintage. He moved slowly up the porch steps, his age showing but his spirit undimmed, and Daniel stood to help him into a chair. "I have news," Harrison said once he was settled. "My attorneys finalized the paperwork yesterday. I'm transferring 50% ownership of the estate to you, Daniel. Equal partners now. You've earned it, and more importantly, you'll outlive me by 20 years. When I'm gone, this place needs someone who understands Vincent's vision, who has the integrity to protect it against commercial pressures. That's you." Daniel started to protest, to say it was too much, but Harrison held up a hand. "I have no children, no family except Vincent's descendants, and none of them want to make wine. This estate is my legacy, and legacy is about choosing the right custodian for what you've built. You're that person. You've proven it over 2 years of hard work, impossible challenges, and decisions that put integrity ahead of profit every time. Take the gift. Honor it by continuing to do what you've been doing." They shook hands, and Daniel felt the weight of what had just been entrusted to him. 80 acres of Napa hillside, a Victorian manor house, winemaking facilities worth millions. But more than that, responsibility for protecting Vincent's vision, for ensuring that the wine they made honored the man who died rather than compromise. Over the next months, life at Castellano Estate settled into rhythms that felt both new and ancient. The 2024 vintage sold out within weeks, its reputation spreading through the wine world like fire through dry grass. Collectors who'd secured bottles reported that the wine was even better than the initial tasting suggested, that it was evolving in bottle, revealing new complexities, proving that Vincent's approach to winemaking produced wines built for the long term, for patient cellaring, for becoming conversation pieces across decades. The second vintage harvest approached with less anxiety than the first. They knew the vineyard now, knew which blocks ripened first, knew the signs that told them grapes had reached optimal maturity. Jean-Paul had trained a young assistant winemaker, a woman in her 30s named Sophia Chen, who'd studied enology at UC Davis and spent 5 years making wine in Burgundy before Harrison recruited her to learn Vincent's techniques. The education center Rebecca had designed opened in September, offering classes in viticulture, winemaking, wine appreciation, and the history of California wine. Students came from across the country to spend a week at the estate, working in the vineyard, attending lectures, tasting through the archive wines, learning that excellence required patience, attention, and the willingness to reject anything that didn't meet the highest standards. Maria expanded the vineyard team, hiring younger workers and training them in the techniques that kept 80-year-old vines productive, teaching them that viticulture was equal parts science and art, that reading what vines needed required observation, experience, and humility before the complexity of natural systems. Michael left consulting permanently, becoming the estate's full-time CFO and general manager. His MBA finally applied to something he cared about passionately rather than just professionally. He married the chef he'd been dating, and they bought a house in Napa, putting down roots in soil that had claimed them both. Rebecca's book about Vincent Castellano was published by a major press and became an unexpected bestseller, appealing to true crime readers and wine enthusiasts in equal measure. The film rights sold to a streaming service, and she was adapting her own book into a limited series that would tell Vincent's story to millions of people who'd never heard of him, spreading his legacy far beyond the wine world. But what struck Daniel most as the years passed was how normal it all felt, how the extraordinary had become routine, how the impossible dream had transformed into daily reality. He walked the vineyard each morning, checking on vines that had become as familiar as family. He spent afternoons in the barrel room with Jean-Paul and Sophia, tasting through the developing vintages, discussing blending trials, debating when wines were ready to bottle. He spent evenings in the manor house study, reading Vincent's journals for the 100th time, finding new insights, new connections, new appreciation for the man whose murder had inadvertently given Daniel's life its deepest purpose. 5 years after that first harvest, on a warm afternoon in late May, Daniel stood in the cemetery at the edge of the property, where a simple stone marked Vincent Castellano's grave. The body had been reinterred here after the investigation concluded, brought home to the land he'd loved, the vines he'd nurtured, the soil he'd understood better than most people understood themselves. Harrison was buried beside him now, having passed peacefully in his sleep 6 months earlier at age 82. The old man had lived long enough to see 5 vintages produced, to know that his uncle's legacy was secure, to understand that his life's work had reached successful conclusion. Daniel placed a bottle of the 2024 Reserve between the graves, an offering to the dead who'd made everything possible, and spoke the words he'd been rehearsing in his mind. "Vincent, I never met you, but you've shaped my life more than most people I knew personally. You taught me that integrity isn't negotiable, that excellence requires sacrifice, that some things are worth dying for because they're worth living for. You died alone, murdered by a man who valued profit over truth, but you weren't forgotten. You weren't erased, and your vision lives on in every bottle we make, every vine we tend, every person who learns from your example." He paused, gathering thoughts that wanted to scatter like leaves in wind. "Harrison, thank you for trusting me with your uncle's legacy. Thank you for seeing potential in a lost widower who didn't know what he was capable of. Thank you for teaching me that purpose is something you build, not something you find. You've both given me more than I can repay. All I can do is continue the work, honor the vision, and make sure that what you died protecting continues to speak truth to anyone willing to listen." The afternoon breeze rustled through the vines, and Daniel imagined it carrying his words to the dead. Imagined them hearing, understanding, approving. He walked back to the manor house where Michael and Rebecca waited, where Jean-Paul and Sophia were preparing for the evening tasting of the newest vintage, where life continued its patient work of transforming grapes into wine, grief into purpose, loss into legacy. The sun set over the western hills, painting the vineyard in golden shadow, and Daniel stood on the porch where he'd stood countless times before, watching darkness claim the valley, while the manor house lights glowed warm behind him. Somewhere in the barrel room, wine aged toward its destiny. Somewhere in the vineyard, vines prepared for another harvest. Somewhere in the world, people opened bottles of Castellano Reserve and tasted truth made tangible. Vincent's vision turned into something you could hold, pour, share. The work would continue, the legacy would grow, and the truth that had survived 56 years of burial would survive centuries more, speaking across generations in a language anyone could understand if they were patient enough to listen, brave enough to believe that excellence endured, that integrity mattered, that some stories refused to end just because the storyteller died. Daniel raised his glass to the gathering darkness, to the vines, to Vincent and Harrison, and everyone who'd fought to make this moment possible, and drank to the truth that wine could speak when words failed, to the legacy that outlasted the men who built it, to the future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. The stars emerged, brilliant and countless, and beneath them Castellano Estate rested, secure in its purpose, confident in its vision, ready for whatever challenges the years ahead would bring. The truth had found its voice, the wine had proven its worth, and the legacy would endure, patient as the vines, inevitable as truth, waiting for each new generation to discover that excellence was timeless, that integrity was its own reward, and that some dreams were worth every sacrifice required to make them real.